Right now, somewhere in your house, in a memory you'd swear was completely your own, there's a decent chance an algorithm helped write it. Not the memory of what happened, the memory of what you think happened. The photo that got surfaced to you at just the right moment. The old post that resurfaced in your feed and rewrote how you felt about a year of your life. The AI-generated summary of a news event that quietly became the version of events you carry around in your head, even though you never read the original story. Here's the question that should keep you up at night if you weren't listening to this to fall asleep. If a machine is helping decide what you remember and how you remember it, who exactly is authoring your memory? Is it still you? For almost all of human history, that question didn't even make sense. Memory belonged to people. It lived in the minds of elders, in the songs passed down around fires, in the shaky handwriting of scribes copying manuscripts by candlelight. It was slow, it was fragile, and it was undeniably human. Then something started to shift. Quietly at first. Clay tablets, scrolls, printed books, photographs, film reels, each one moved a little more of our memory outside of our own skulls and into something external, something that could be stored, copied, edited, lost, or rewritten by someone else entirely. Tonight, we're going to trace that whole strange journey. From the first oral cultures who had to memorize entire histories word for word, because writing didn't exist yet, all the way to right now, where generative AI can write a paragraph of history that never actually happened and hand it to you with complete confidence. It's a long story, it's a slow one, and that's exactly why it works so well as background for sleep. Nobody voted on any of this. There was no single moment where humanity decided, yes, let's hand over a piece of our memory to a machine. It happened gradually, the same way it always has. And it's happening again right now, while most of us aren't paying attention. Before we get into it, if you're listening to this while drifting off, which let's be honest is probably exactly why you're here, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is for you right now. I check the comments constantly, and it's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. Someone in Manila at 2 a.m, someone in Toronto right after dinner, someone in Lisbon just waking up. It's a strange, quiet comfort knowing this is playing in so many different time zones at once, all these different corners of the world, drifting off to the same slow story. And if you want to support the show in a way that actually helps, the biggest thing you can do is follow along on Spotify and leave a 5-star review. There's a link in the description. It genuinely helps more people find these episodes. Now let's slow down, get comfortable, and go all the way back to before writing existed at all. Back to a time when the only place memory could live was inside another human being. Let's start with something that feels obvious, but almost nobody actually believes deep down. Your memory is not a recording. It never was. It never will be. There is no internal camera rolling somewhere behind your eyes, capturing footage that gets pulled up and played back whenever you need it. That's not how any of this works, and it's never worked that way. Not for you, not for your grandparents, not for the first humans who ever sat around a fire and tried to remember where the good hunting grounds were 3 winters ago. What actually happens when you remember something is closer to reconstruction. Your brain takes fragments, an emotion, a smell, a half-image, a sense of who was standing where, and it rebuilds the moment from scratch, almost like a story being told for the first time, except the storyteller is you, and the audience is also you. This is why 2 siblings can remember the exact same childhood event in completely different ways, sometimes contradicting each other so thoroughly you'd think they grew up in separate households. Neither one is necessarily lying. They're each reconstructing a version shaped by their own emotional stakes, their own need to make sense of what happened. Memory bends toward meaning. It always has. And it doesn't stop at the individual level. Families do this too. There's usually one version of how mum and dad met, one version of what happened during that one holiday nobody talks about, repeated so many times at so many dinner tables that it hardens into something that feels like fact, even when the details have quietly shifted over 20 years of retelling. Communities do the same thing on a larger scale. Nations do it on a scale larger still. What we call history, at least the popular version of it, the version most people carry around, is often just collective memory, agreed upon, repeated, and passed down until it feels less like a story and more like bedrock. Here's something that might sound strange at first. Forgetting isn't a flaw in this system, it's a feature. If your brain held onto every single detail of every single day with equal weight, you wouldn't be remembering, you'd be drowning. Forgetting is pruning. It's compression. It's your mind quietly deciding which details matter enough to keep and which ones can be released back into the void, so that what remains actually means something instead of just taking up space. A life fully recorded in perfect detail wouldn't feel like a life at all. It would feel like static, which brings us to something our species figured out very, very early, long before anyone could write a single word. We are not limited to the memory inside our own heads. We never really were, and not, tied in a cord to mark the passing of a season. A pile of stones stacked to mark where someone was buried. A scar carved into a tree to remember a boundary. These were some of the earliest forms of what researchers sometimes call external memory, tools and environments doing part of the remembering for us, offloading the work outside the fragile, forgetful, endlessly reconstructing human brain. And this is really the thread worth holding onto as we move forward tonight. Every single time humans have invented a new way to store memory outside their own skulls, something else has changed along with it. Not just what gets remembered, but who we understand ourselves to be. Identity, culture, even the shape of truth itself, all of it shifts a little whenever the tools of memory shift. It happened when we started tying knots in cords. It happened when we started speaking in structured, repeatable stories. And as we're about to see, it happened in one of the most demanding, most awe-inspiring memory systems humans ever built, long before anyone thought to write anything down at all. Imagine a world where almost everything that mattered only existed when someone was willing to say it out loud. No shelves, no books, no hard drives humming quietly in the background. If you wanted to keep a law, a story, a recipe for medicine, or the exact route to a seasonal waterhole, you had one option. You had to carry it in living people. This is what human culture looked like for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence. Not mostly oral with a bit of writing, but fully oral. If no one remembered it, it was gone. If no one could recite it, it didn't exist. And so people did something extraordinary. They re-engineered speech itself into a technology of preservation. They used repetition. Not just casual repetition, but dense, deliberate layers of it. Important stories weren't told once, they were told every year at the same festival, every season at the same gathering, every evening by the same elders. Names, lineages, place markers, obligations, all embedded in phrases that appeared again and again until they etched grooves into the mind. They used rhythm. A flat list is hard to remember. A patterned list with a beat almost remembers itself. So laws became chants, genealogies became poems, maps became songs where each verse followed the path of a river or the curve of a coastline. If you've ever had a song stuck in your head for days, you've experienced the same principle. Oral cultures weaponized that effect and aimed it at survival. They used structure. Information was nested inside stories, because stories are easier to hold than raw facts. A myth about how the world began might quietly encode instructions about when to plant, which animals are taboo, which families owe allegiance to which others. The narrative kept the details glued together, and they used ritual. You didn't just say the important things, You said them in the right place, at the right time, in front of the right people. Ritual wasn't only about the sacred, it was also about quality control. If you recited the lineage wrong in front of everyone during the winter gathering, there would be dozens of ears ready to correct you. Public performance became a kind of peer review. Over time, entire social roles formed around this work. You see versions of them all over the world. In West Africa, there are griots, hereditary custodians of history and genealogy, able to recite centuries of births, marriages, treaties, and wars. In ancient Greece, there were bards who could perform epics thousands of lines long, keeping heroic pasts alive before anyone wrote them down. In many indigenous societies, there are songmen and women, storytellers, keepers of lore songs and dreamings, each trained for years to carry their part of the collective archive. These people weren't entertainers first. They were infrastructure. They were walking, breathing databases, and societies treated them that way. You could consult them about who owned which piece of land, who had broken which agreement, which ancestor had granted which right. Their memory work was a public service, and often a sacred one. Of course, this raised a difficult issue that we're still wrestling with today, the tension between flexibility and fidelity. On one hand, oral traditions had to be stable. If the planting date in a ritual song drifted randomly every generation, people could starve. So the core of a story, its structure, key characters, crucial injunctions, tended to be guarded carefully. Apprentice reciters were corrected, sometimes harshly, when they strayed too far from the accepted form. Accuracy, in that sense, was a matter of survival. On the other hand, a story that never changed at all would slowly stop making sense. Environments shifted. Leaders came and went. New neighbours appeared on the horizon. The past had to be reinterpreted in a way that made the present livable, so within the stable scaffolding there was room to improvise. A skilled griot might emphasise different episodes depending on who was listening. A bard might subtly adjust a hero's motives to match current morals. A law story might acquire a new verse to address a conflict no one had faced before. This is one of the paradoxes of oral memory systems. They can be incredibly conservative and surprisingly fluid at the same time. The story stays the same, but its tone, examples, and implications slide quietly to fit the needs of each generation. Meaning is preserved even as details drift. That drift was not neutral. Power flowed through it, because memory lived inside people. The people who controlled public recitation could shape what counted as the official past. A chief could sponsor a version of a lineage that strengthened his claim. A priestly class could insist that certain stories were too sacred for common ears, keeping key interpretive power to themselves. Conquerors could demand that their victories be woven into local myths, so that over time their rule felt less like an interruption and more like destiny. What was remembered loudly in public gatherings and what was only whispered in kitchens at night could be very different things. Oral cultures, like written ones, had official histories and unofficial ones, prestigious narratives and marginal ones. The difference is that in a purely oral world, the quiet versions were always at greater risk of vanishing when the last person who knew them died. And this points us toward the limits of a world without material records. Some kinds of information simply don't do well in long-term oral storage. Exact numbers are fragile. Precise measurements, multi-step calculations, long tables of data. These are hard to embed in a song or a myth in a way that survives centuries without error. Fine-grained chronology, with exact dates and durations, tends to blur into long ago or in our grandparents' time. Mundane details that don't attach to strong emotion or ritual rarely last. No one memorizes the equivalent of every grocery list from 3 generations back. Whole cities have risen and fallen without leaving more than faint traces in the oral record, especially when their ruins were swallowed by jungle or sea. Entire languages disappeared when small communities were wiped out by disease or war, taking with them ways of categorizing the world that no one else had ever used. And yet, some things are astonishingly resilient. Cosmologies can travel thousands of years across unbroken chains of speakers. Songlines can encode landscapes so precisely that, when anthropologists checked them against satellite imagery, they found ancient pathways aligned with real water sources and landforms. Deep ecological knowledge, what plants cure which illnesses, which winds herald which storms, can persist as proverbs and taboos long after anyone remembers how those sayings first arose. What tends to survive best in purely oral systems are the things most tightly bound to identity and survival: who we are, where we came from, who we owe, and what we must never forget if we want the community to endure. For most of our species' history, that was enough. An intricate weave of repetition, rhythm, ritual, and authority kept the critical parts of the past alive inside living minds. But it was also fragile. It depended on uninterrupted chains of teaching, on stable communities, on the continued existence of people trained for decades to hold the stories in their heads. When those chains broke through famine, conquest, epidemic, vast swaths of the human past vanished as if they had never been. And slowly in a few corners of the world, pressure began to build for something even more stubborn than memory, something that could outlast the voices that spoke it. That's when humans started pushing memory into matter, and the world's archive began to change shape again. The first experiments were almost embarrassingly practical. Before poetry, before philosophy, before anyone wrote down a myth about the gods, people started scratching marks to keep track of very boring things. How many sheep? How much grain? Who owed what to whom? In ancient Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, small clay tokens stood in for quantities. A cone might mean a measure of barley, a sphere might mean a jar of oil. Merchants and temple officials sealed these tokens inside clay envelopes to represent a transaction. Then someone had the extremely reasonable thought, instead of putting the tokens inside, what if we just press their shapes onto the outside? A few centuries later, those impressions turn into stylized marks. The envelopes flatten into tablets. A system of writing, cuneiform, emerges, not from a desire to tell stories, but from a need to remember debts. This is the pivot. Memory begins to move out of bodies and into objects. For the first time, you can have a record that doesn't depend on a living specialist to keep it stable. A clay tablet doesn't forget because the scribe catches a fever. A tally of grain deliveries doesn't shift because a reciter favours one family over another. Information becomes something you can store in a warehouse instead of inside a head. At the beginning, that storage is almost entirely administrative. We tend to romanticize the birth of writing, but most of the earliest texts we found are not epic poems. They are receipts, tax lists, inventories, ration logs, legal contracts. The palace wants to know how much has been collected. The temple wants to verify who brought which offering. A merchant wants proof that he really did deliver those 10 donkeys 3 months ago. In an oral world, such things were handled by reputation and memory. In a written one, they start to be handled by documents. You can imagine the shift in social feeling. Suddenly, there's a new kind of truth, not what the elder remembers, not what the community agrees to in the square, but what is impressed, dried, and stored on clay. Administrative memory becomes its own ecosystem. Bureaucracies grow around it. Scribes are trained, not to walk across the landscape singing the story of the rivers, but to sit indoors copying columns of numbers and names. Laws are no longer just spoken by a king at a gathering. They are inscribed, sometimes literally carved into stone, and set up in public places. Think of the famous Code of Hammurabi in Babylon. Whether or not it was followed exactly as written, its very existence announces a new idea that law can be something fixed, external, and theoretically knowable by all, rather than a flexible set of precedents held in the minds of judges and chiefs. This is the birth of what we might call bureaucratic truth. If it's written, it's real. If it's stamped with the right seal, it happened. If your name is on the list, you owe the tax. But of course, writing doesn't just preserve, it also centralizes. Those who can write, or who control the archives where writing is stored, gain a new kind of power over the past and the future. They can decide which transactions are recorded and which quietly vanish. They can draft the version of an agreement that becomes official. They can keep track of who is in debt, who has paid, who is late, and for how long. Memory, which once lived in the distributed network of many minds, begins to pool in specialized institutions, temples, palaces, scribal schools, and later royal and private libraries. If you want access to those frozen memories, you have to deal with the people who run those places. Still, the technology spreads and mutates. Clay works well in Mesopotamia, where the right mud is everywhere, and the climate can bake tablets hard enough to last thousands of years. Elsewhere, people experiment with other materials. The Egyptians developed papyrus, thin sheets made from reeds along the Nile, light and portable compared to heavy clay. In China, people write on bamboo slips and silk long before paper becomes common. Each medium changes what memory feels like. Clay tablets are heavy and durable. They encourage short, compact records, things worth the effort to inscribe and dry. Papyrus scrolls and later bound codices allow for longer narratives, layered commentaries, continuous arguments. Suddenly, you can have not just a list of taxes, but a history of a king's reign, a medical manual, a philosophical dialogue. As writing escapes the counting house and enters temples, courts, schools, and eventually households, human thought begins to reorganize around what can be put into marks. Lists become more elaborate. Genealogies extend further back, no longer bounded by what a trained reciter can hold. Chronicles appear, sequences of events arranged in something approximating chronological order. Stories can be copied, compared, and standardized across distance. A myth recited in one city can match almost word for word the version known in another, even if their storytellers have never met. But not everyone is convinced this is an unqualified blessing. Centuries later in ancient Greece, we hear one of the most famous early critiques of writing. In Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, he puts into the mouth of Socrates a story about the Egyptian god Thoth, who supposedly invented writing and offered it to a king as a gift. Thoth praises his new invention as an aid to memory and wisdom. The king disagrees. Writing, he says, will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who learn it because they will stop exercising their internal memory. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. People will have the appearance of wisdom because they can look things up, but not the reality, because they have not truly learned. Whether or not this story is historically accurate, it captures an anxiety that must have surfaced again and again as writing spread. If we push our memories into clay and papyrus, what happens to the memories inside us? Socrates himself, at least as Plato presents him, never writes. His whole method depends on live conversation, the kind of dialogue that dies if it isn't embodied. And yet, ironically, we only know him because Plato broke that rule and wrote the dialogues down. This tension runs through the whole history of external memory. Each time we offload something from our minds to a medium, we gain stability and scale, but risk dulling some internal skill. Writing creates new kinds of permanence, but it also creates new ways to manipulate that permanence. A sung genealogy can be quietly adapted in performance, but it is hard to erase altogether in a community that remembers its shape. A written genealogy can be recopied with certain names omitted. A law inscribed on a tablet can be replaced by a slightly edited version, and a generation later, that may be the only one anyone sees. Archives can burn. Scrolls can be selectively destroyed. Whole libraries can be curated to favour one dynasty, one doctrine, one version of events. The physical sturdiness of written records gives them weight, but their location in specific buildings under specific authorities makes them vulnerable to targeted control. At the same time, literacy reshapes who counts as an expert. In many early civilizations, writing is a narrow skill, often restricted to a scribal class. Education, for those who receive it, is not only about absorbing stories and norms, but about mastering scripts and languages. To be literate is to belong to an elite capable of creating and interpreting the new external memories. Priests who can read sacred texts gain authority over those texts' meaning. Judges who can consult legal codes gain leverage over disputes. Merchants who can keep their own ledgers need not rely entirely on spoken promises and other people's recollections. Slowly, the centre of credibility begins to tilt. In an oral world, a credible person is someone known to the community, whose memory has been tested in public performance. In a literate world, a credible statement is one backed by a document, a charter, a letter, a written warrant. The phrase "show me the papers" becomes, in various forms, a recurring demand. Education changes shape to fit this. Instead of only memorizing and reciting, students are taught to copy, to read, to interpret. Schools in Mesopotamia drill young scribes on long lists of signs. Greek and Roman students practice copying speeches and verses. In China, complex examination systems eventually develop in which success depends on one's ability to reproduce and comment on canonical texts. Literacy turns the human mind outward, toward a landscape of inscriptions that stretch beyond any one person's capacity to memorize. The individual no longer has to carry everything, they only need to know where to look and how to decode what has been written. For a long time, this externalization is limited by material scarcity. Clay tablets are heavy. Papyrus is fragile and costly. Scrolls take time to copy. The amount of written memory in the world is still tiny compared to the ocean of things people know and say. But the principle has been established. Memory is no longer only something you are, it is something you can build, store, and inherit in physical form. The archive has left the body, and in a few more technological turns, it will become so large and so fast that people will begin to feel overwhelmed by how much there is to remember, even when it's all written down. If writing is memory poured into objects, then libraries are what happen when those objects start to pile up. Once you have more than a few tablets or scrolls, you face a new problem. Not how to record, but how to find. The earliest great libraries we know of, like those at Ebla, Mari, and later Nineveh, look less like the quiet reading rooms we imagine and more like dense, carefully arranged warehouses of clay. Shelves lined with tablets, rooms devoted to particular kinds of text, omens here, legal codes there, rituals in another corner. Someone had to decide what went where. Someone had to remember which room held which set of memories. Very early on, humans begin to invent a new layer of technology. Not just writing, but systems for retrieving what has been written. In Mesopotamia, scribes sometimes inscribed brief labels on the edges of tablets, or placed colophons at the end, a sort of title, the name of the series it belongs to, the first line of the next tablet. In temple and palace libraries, tablets might be grouped by genre or function, astrological series here, medicinal recipes there, incantations in another stack. It doesn't look like much, but it's the beginning of something profound. The idea that knowledge is not just a heap, but can be arranged, classified, and navigated. As collections grow, these retrieval systems become more elaborate. In Egypt, temple and palace collections of papyrus rolls seem to have been organized under broad headings: ritual texts, medical treatises, records. In ancient China, imperial collections gradually sort texts into categories that will later harden into a canonical scheme: classics, histories, philosophical works, miscellaneous writings. And then there is the Library of Alexandria, half history, half legend, standing in for an entire dream about total memory. Founded in the Hellenistic period, under the Ptolemies, its ambition, at least in later tradition, is startling: to gather all the books in the world. Ships arriving in the harbour are said to have had their scrolls temporarily confiscated, copied, and sometimes kept. Scholars from many regions worked there, reading, comparing, editing, annotating. You can sense the next pressure point. If you bring everything together, how do you avoid being lost in it? Alexandrian scholars responded with what we might call the first large-scale search tools. Callimachus, a poet and scholar, is credited with composing the Pentakes, a vast catalogue of authors and works, reportedly stretching to hundreds of volumes. It organized scrolls by author, by subject, by the opening words of the text. It gave short biographies, lists of works, sometimes critical notes. It turned a chaotic mass of scrolls into a navigable landscape. This is an early retrieval algorithm written in ink instead of code. Want plays by a particular dramatist. Consult the catalogue. Looking for treatises on medicine or commentaries on Homer. The catalogue tells you where in the physical space of the library those minds have been stored. Elsewhere, similar solutions appear in different forms. In Buddhist monasteries, catalogue scrolls list sutras and commentaries, often organized by doctrinal themes. In the Islamic Golden Age, great libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and elsewhere maintain book lists and subject classifications. Scholars compose bibliographies, indexes of hadith, legal opinions, philosophical works, arranged according to intricate systems of law or theology. Medieval monasteries in Europe developed book inventories and shelf marks, codes that tell you which cabinet, which shelf, which position a manuscript occupies. Later, as universities grow, more formal catalogues and subject classifications emerge to manage swelling collections. Slowly, a pattern repeats. Every time human societies expand their external memory, they must also expand the tools that let them navigate it. But these tools are never neutral. To catalogue is to choose. To shelve is to decide what sits beside what. To copy is to vote for a text's survival. In ancient and medieval worlds where every copy is made by hand, survival is expensive. A book that is recopied every generation persists. One that is left to moulder can vanish without a trace. The people who run these memory machines, kings, priests, scholars, librarians, hold quiet power. They can promote certain texts by having them copied widely, translated into new languages, placed at the centre of curricula. They can marginalize others by leaving them uncopied or stored in rooms few are allowed to enter. They can decide that a particular version of a chronicle is the authoritative one, and let rival versions fall apart slowly on a back shelf. Whole religious canons are shaped this way. The scriptures that become central to Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and other traditions often pass through long periods of selection, comparison, and standardization in very specific institutional libraries. Councils meet, editors harmonize. Manuscripts that support the favored version are recopied and distributed. Those that do not are set aside. From the inside, it can feel like recognizing eternal truth. From the outside, it is also a story about which memories received the scarce resources of ink, time, and attention. Scarcity haunts all of this. Before printing, a library of a few thousand volumes is enormous, representing lifetimes of work. There are only so many scribes, only so much parchment, only so many hours in the day. Every book copied is another that is not. Every shelf filled pushes some other potential text into non-existence. This scarcity quietly shapes what counts as known. If a medical recipe exists in one fragile copy in one monastery, it is effectively unknown to almost everyone. If a philosophical commentary exists in 100 copies across a wide territory, it becomes, in practice, the way educated people talk about that philosophy. When knowledge is bound to physical copies, rarity and distribution are as important as truth. At the same time, centralizing so much memory in a few places creates its own peculiar risk. Libraries can burn. We think of the fires at Alexandria, though the details are murky and probably involved multiple episodes over centuries. We know more concretely about the destruction of the Royal Library at Nineveh, the loss of countless works when Roman libraries fell, the burning of manuscripts in wars, invasions, and religious purges in many regions. Sometimes the loss is dramatic, shelves consumed in a night. Sometimes slower, ink fading, damp seeping in, insects chewing their way through parchment. Political shifts can turn a collection from cherished treasure to dangerous heresy. A new ruler may order the destruction of texts associated with a rival. A reformer may burn books deemed corrupting or false. Centralized memory is powerful, but it is also fragile. Concentrate too much of the world's knowledge in a handful of buildings, and a single catastrophe, a fire, a flood, a change of regime can erase entire branches of thought. There is a strange double feeling in these ancient and medieval archives. On one hand, they represent an unprecedented expansion of human memory, whole civilizations' worth of stories, laws, rituals and speculations gathered in one place. On the other, they mark the first hints of something like information overload. Scholars complain that there are too many books to master, too many commentaries on the same text, too many rival authorities. They argue over which works are truly essential and which are distractions. They devise syllabi, reading lists, hierarchies of texts not unlike modern recommended reading and core curricula. Underneath these practical worries lies a deeper shift. In an oral world, the problem is often keeping enough memory alive. In a world of libraries and catalogues, the problem begins to tilt towards selection. Out of all the things that have been written, which ones will we carry forward? This quiet, continuous act of choosing what to copy, what to organize, what to forget, will only grow more intense as new technologies for reproduction arrive. The next great leap will not only multiply the number of books, but also harden certain texts into standard versions in a way even the largest ancient library could barely imagine. For centuries, the bottleneck was human hands. Every book, every scroll, every codex had to pass through a scribe. Copying was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Margins filled with corrections, glosses, and occasional complaints. No two copies were quite the same. Memory, even when written down, still behaved like a living tradition, drifting, mutating, accumulating layers. Then, in mid-15th century Europe, something snapped. Movable type printing, developed in China centuries earlier, but adapted with metal type and oil-based inks in the workshops of people like Gutenberg, took that bottleneck and blew it open. The change wasn't that books suddenly existed. It was that they could exist in hundreds, even thousands of identical copies produced in weeks instead of decades. Scale, standardization, speed. Those three together quietly rewired what truth looked like. With a press, once you've set a page of type, you can run off page after page with the same layout, the same spelling, the same sequence of words. The wobble of the scribe's hand vanishes, the idiosyncrasies of local script traditions flatten out. A text that might have had as many variants as it had manuscripts suddenly stabilizes into a single dominant version. For the first time, memory doesn't just persist, it repeats. That repetition has strange consequences. On one hand, errors become easier to fix. A misprint spotted in one edition can be corrected in the next, and that corrected text can then spread across a continent. Scholars begin to collate multiple printed versions, compare them line by line, debate which should count as correct. Critical editing, in something like the modern sense, becomes possible when you can lay many copies side by side. On the other hand, once an error is baked into type and run off 500 times, it gains a new kind of authority. A mistaken date, a distorted quotation, a garbled verse, if it appears identically in copy after copy, scattered across cities and decades, it starts to feel official. The very uniformity that allows correction also allows fossilization. Print can purify tradition, but it can also freeze a mistake so thoroughly that later generations inherit it as fact. Authority migrates quietly, from the scribe's workshop and the monastery library to the printed page itself. A phrase begins to circulate in early modern Europe. As it is printed becomes almost synonymous with verified. If a dispute arises about a point of law or doctrine, people increasingly reach not for the memory of a local teacher, but for a printed edition of a canon, a code, a Bible. And once print exists, people discover very quickly that controlling it means controlling which truths can appear at scale. This becomes painfully obvious in the age of the Reformation. In the early 16th century, small printed pamphlets, cheap, quickly produced, often illustrated with vivid woodcuts, become the viral posts and chain emails of their time. Martin Luther's theses and sermons, reprinted and translated, spread far beyond what personal preaching could have achieved. Response pamphlets follow. Satirical broadsides attack the papacy. Defences pour out in Latin and the vernacular. For the first time, ordinary townspeople can hold in their hands a piece of theological argument, a political cartoon, a royal proclamation, all set in the same crisp black type that once was reserved for Bibles and law books. Print turns text into a political weapon. Memory, which in oral and manuscript cultures had flowed mostly downward, from priest to congregation, from scholar to student, suddenly begins to move sideways and even upward. A well-timed pamphlet can embarrass a prince, inflame a city, or rally support for a reform. Governments and churches respond with censorship regimes, indexes of forbidden books, licenses for printers. The struggle is no longer only over what is true, but over what is allowed to be replicated. At the same time, this flood of standardized text calls new kinds of readers into being. In many regions, literacy begins to creep beyond narrow clerical and elite circles. Townspeople learn to read not only to access scripture, but to keep up with news, edicts, satirical verse. Gradually, a public forms, people who, though never meeting, share reference points because they have read the same printed pages. But uniform text does not guarantee uniform understanding. If everyone in a city can now buy the same printed Bible, disagreements don't disappear, they multiply. The text is fixed, but the interpretations branch. Protestants and Catholics, humanists and traditionalists, monarchists and republicans all point to the same lines and draw different conclusions. Commentaries proliferate. Margins fill again, this time with individual readers' notes rather than scribes' corrections. Standardized memory creates new conflicts over meaning. Science changes under this pressure too. Before print, an experimental result or a new astronomical observation might live in a single manuscript, known to a small circle. With printing, an observation can be described in careful detail and sent through networks of correspondents and booksellers to other observers who can try to replicate it. Tables of data, diagrams, and mathematical proofs can be reproduced precisely enough that errors in reasoning can be spotted, challenged, refined. The idea of a scientific community depends on this. Many people in many places looking at the same text and testing whether the world behaves as it says. Law begins to harden in a similar way. Legal codes, previously scattered across manuscripts and local usages, start to be printed, ordered, and periodically revised. Judges, lawyers, and petitioners can consult the same printed volumes. Precedent gains weight when it is not just remembered by practitioners, but inscribed identically in books that circulate from court to court. Religious canons, scientific theories, legal systems all become more networked, more self-aware, once print gives them stable, widely shared reference texts. And yet, underneath the confidence of crisp black letters, the same old tensions persist. Who decides which version of a sacred text gets printed and reprinted? Which legal commentaries are incorporated into official editions, and which are left in obscurity? Which scientific claims earn a book of their own, and which remain scattered in letters that never see a press? The scarcity hasn't vanished. It has shifted. There are still only so many presses, so much paper, so many readers' hours. But now the battle over memory plays out, not just in quiet scriptoria and royal libraries, but in bustling print shops, market stalls, and private homes. The world has taken a first step toward a new kind of collective memory, one that can be stamped, multiplied, and shipped across mountains and seas, and one that for the first time can overload not just scholars, but anyone who tries to keep up with the flow of pages landing on their table. Then, a few centuries later, something even stranger happens. Memory grows eyes. For thousands of years, if you wanted to bring the past into the present, you had to do it with words or with hand-made images. A painting of a king, a sketch of a battlefield, a diagram of a comet. All of them passed through the filter of a human hand and human interpretation. Everyone understood that. A portrait could flatter, a sketch could exaggerate, a map could lie. In the 19th century, that intuition starts to erode. Early photography arrives as a kind of alchemy. Light itself leaves a trace on treated plates. Exposures are long, equipment is bulky, chemicals are finicky, but the promise is intoxicating. No more depending on an artist's memory or an eyewitness's description. The scene writes itself. Very quickly, a new association hardens in people's minds. An image is not just a representation. It is evidence. Courts begin accepting photographs as documentation. Police departments build mugshot archives. Scientists photograph the surface of the moon, the structure of snowflakes, the sequence of a horse's gallop. Families pose stiffly in studios to capture faces that, for the first time in history, can outlive the memory of anyone who knew them. The old phrase, "I saw it with my own eyes," quietly gains an upgrade. There's a picture. But even at the beginning, the gap between seeing and knowing doesn't vanish, it just moves. Because photography is never simply what was there. It is where the camera stood, what it pointed at, how long the shutter was open, which plate was selected, which image was kept, and which was discarded. Early photographers learned this immediately. They rearrange furniture in studio portraits. They prompt subjects to hold poses that convey dignity, sorrow, romance. They add painted backdrops, props, costumes. In some cases, they create composite images, combining multiple negatives to place people in scenes they never actually occupied. Spirit photography in the late 19th century is an almost too perfect example. Photographers produce ghostly double exposures that seem to show dead relatives hovering near their grieving families. For many viewers, these images feel more persuasive than any séance. Light has recorded the impossible. Who are they to argue? The lesson is old, but the medium is new. Every image is a choice. Still, photography slips into private life in a way no previous recording technology ever has. The family album becomes a small portable archive. Births, weddings, holidays, awkward school pictures. Over time, a pattern emerges. People rarely photograph the arguments, the boredom, the months where nothing in particular happens. They photograph the peaks. Later, when those albums are opened, those peaks become the landscape. A childhood might have been mostly ordinary days, occasional loneliness, long stretches of waiting. But the record, what is visible, shareable, flippable, shows birthdays, vacations, smiles. The mind, which is already prone to editing, now has a physical script to lean on. Memory and photograph begin to co-author each other. You remember the day at the beach partly because it happened, and partly because, for years, you have seen yourself there, frozen in that one sun-caught moment, as if the whole summer felt like that. On the public stage, the stakes are higher. As soon as cameras can be carried into streets and battlefields, war starts leaving a different kind of trace. In the Crimean War and the American Civil War, photographers haul heavy equipment to the edges of conflict. Exposures are still too long to capture the chaos of combat itself, but they can capture the aftermath. Bodies on the ground, ruined buildings, tired soldiers. Newspapers publish engravings based on these images. Later, magazines print the photographs directly. For distant publics, war is no longer only a matter of speeches and casualty lists. It has a face, a field, a specific corpse. That shock does not go unnoticed by governments and armies. Very quickly, officials learn that controlling images is as important as controlling territory. Some scenes are encouraged: troops marching in neat formation, flags waving, generals on horseback. Other scenes are suppressed: civilian casualties, desertion, the wounded left untreated. By the 20th century, photography is fully enlisted in propaganda. Posters and newsreels recycle the same heroic images, hammering a single narrative into collective memory. A raising of a flag on a captured island, a soldier helping a child across rubble. These moments did occur, but their photographic capture and repetition elevate them from events to emblems. They come to stand in many minds. For the entire war, what is not photographed or not printed rarely becomes part of the story at all. Then film arrives, and memory gains not only eyes but time. At first, films are simple scenes: workers leaving a factory, a train arriving at a station. People reportedly duck, laugh, reach out, as though the moving image might spill into the room. The shock is not just motion, but persistence. For a few seconds you are watching an unbroken slice of the past replay itself. Soon, filmmakers discover that they are not bound to simple slices. They can cut, splice, reorder. They can make time jump forward and back. They can show a person as a child, then as an adult, then as a memory in someone else's mind. They can stage dreams, fantasies, alternate histories. A camera can be placed high above a city, at the feet of a crowd, inside a miniature model of a battlefield. Film turns representation into a kind of shared dream. Audiences across continents watch the same scenes, hear the same lines, feel the same orchestrated emotions at roughly the same moments in their lives. A romantic ideal, a vision of heroism, a stereotype of a foreign country, all can be rehearsed on screen, then carried silently into millions of individual memories. The line between personal recollection and cinematic reference grows thin. Someone remembers the war through the lens of newsreels and later movies. Someone else recalls what falling in love should feel like, having absorbed it first as a sequence of edited scenes and swelling music. In conversation, people quote films as if they were shared experiences. In a sense, they are. Photography and film do not make memory more accurate. They make it more material. They give the past a surface that can be passed around, filed, censored, restored, colorized, replayed. An argument about what happened can now hinge on a single frame, a few seconds of footage. Look, someone says, it's right there. But even in this new regime, the old questions persist, quietly unchanged beneath the shimmer of light on emulsion. Who chose that angle? Who stood just outside the frame? Who cut this reel and left another one on the floor? Memory has started to look like evidence, but it is still being composed. By the early 20th century, the past has eyes and motion. Now it grows a voice, and for the first time that voice can speak to millions of people at once. Radio does something almost no previous medium could manage. It stitches time together. A newspaper can be read in the morning or at midnight. A photograph can be examined decades after it's taken. A film can be projected again and again, but a broadcast happens now. It is a slice of time that evaporates as soon as it's heard. When a famous speech goes out over early radio, everyone listening hears the same words in the same order at the same moment. If the signal reaches farms, cities, ships at sea, troops in barracks, all of them are pulled into the same present. This is new. Before, memory drifted. People in different towns heard different rumours, read different pamphlets, listened to different storytellers. The delay between an event and its retelling could be days, weeks, months. Now a single voice can define what today feels like for an entire nation. Temporal control becomes a form of memory control. If a government declares war at noon on a Tuesday and the announcement is carried live on every station, that noon becomes a hinge in millions of minds. Later, when people think back, they don't just remember the event. They remember where they were when the sound arrived. In the kitchen, in the factory, in a crowded bar, all of them hearing the time snap into a new shape. Shared reference points multiply. Radio schedules create daily rhythms that millions unconsciously adopt. Morning news, midday reports, evening dramas, late-night music. Certain programs become fixtures, a weekly address, a serial adventure, a beloved comedy show. People arrange chores and meals around them. The broadcast clock becomes a kind of national heartbeat. Memory begins to cluster around these pulses. A drought, a strike, an election, a disaster at sea. If it reaches the airwaves, it enters a kind of synchronized archive. Years later, people don't just recall that something happened. They recall when we heard it on the radio. Television eventually turns this effect up several notches. Now the shared voice is joined by shared images, delivered in real time. A moon landing, a presidential debate, a famous concert, a building on fire. Families across a continent sit in their living rooms and watch the same glowing rectangles, absorbing the same carefully framed moments. The result is a strange kind of unity. People who have never met can assume a common set of scenes. The same jingles stuck in their heads, the same catchphrases, the same newscaster's face delivering the nightly summation of what the world supposedly did that day. National narratives crystallize around those faces and schedules. A country comes to recognize itself in its broadcast mirror. The voice of the nation is not just a metaphor, it is a literal voice read from a teleprompter at 6 o'clock. Subtle choices, what stories lead, which images repeat, which events are never mentioned, quietly define what counts as history and what is treated as background noise. Because radio and television are not open commons. They are bottlenecks. Only a limited number of frequencies can be used without interference. Only so many hours exist in a day. Only a few channels can reach most homes. That scarcity creates power. Editors and producers decide what fits through the narrow gate of airtime. They choose which speech is carried live and which is summarized, which protest is shown as a few chaotic seconds of crowd noise, and which is explained in detail, which foreign conflict becomes a nightly segment, and which is reduced to a headline, if that. The politics of airtime become the politics of memory. Governments quickly recognize this. State broadcasters appear, or private ones are quietly steered. Licenses can be granted or revoked. Friendly hosts are promoted. Dissenting voices are moved to inconvenient hours or dropped entirely. In some regimes, radios are manufactured to receive only official stations. TV news is surrounded by patriotic music, national symbols, carefully curated imagery. Even in more pluralistic systems, the pattern holds. Competing networks still share certain assumptions about what is newsworthy. The range of stories may broaden, but the frame remains. A small number of gatekeepers deciding each day what millions will call what happened. Inside that frame, memory gets compressed. Live broadcasts are expensive. Attention spans are limited. Complexity does not sit easily in a 3-minute slot. So the world is shaved down into sound bites. A lengthy policy debate becomes a 10-second quote. A complex social movement is represented by its most dramatic chant or its most extreme sign. An entire war might be summarized by a single photograph flashed on screen and a short, punchy line read over marching music. For audiences, these fragments become anchors. Ask someone about a crisis decades later, and what surfaces is often not the details, but the slogan that was repeated over and over, the phrase clipped and replayed between advertisements. Broadcast media learn to value what is memorable over what is complete. A phrase that plays well on the evening news is more likely to be chosen than a careful paragraph that requires silence and thought. Gradually, slogans begin to pre-shape events themselves. Politicians craft lines designed to survive as clips. Activists aim for images that will make the nightly news. Corporations write jingles that, once heard, will hum quietly in the mind for a lifetime. A portion of human creativity is redirected toward designing future memories. Short, sticky, endlessly replayable. Meanwhile, the boundary between information and entertainment steadily thins. Radio never carries only speeches and bulletins. It carries music, dramas, comedy. Television quickly mixes news with variety shows, sports, soap operas, game shows. The same set that displays a famine also hosts a quiz about brand names an hour later. Over time, these different genres bleed into each other. News adopts the pacing and emotional beats of entertainment. Theme music swells before a serious report. Anchors develop personas. Tragedies are teased before commercial breaks. Elections are framed as horse races, complete with graphics and catchphrases. At the same time, entertainment borrows from news. Sitcoms reference current events. Dramas weave real political scandals into their plots. Fictional shows create archetypes of families, workers, soldiers, foreigners that feel more familiar than the messy realities they gesture toward. Viewers absorb a world made of headlines and scripts, shuffled together in a single continuous stream. Cultural identity begins to coalesce around that stream. People define themselves not only by language, region, or religion, but by what they grew up watching, which host they trust, which station they leave on in the background. Shared television moments stand in for shared experience. A famous finale, a shocking live broadcast, a beloved children's show theme, these become markers of generation and belonging. Memory, once scattered among stories told at local firesides and tables, is now synchronized by towers and transmitters. At specific hours, light and sound beam out, and millions quietly adjust their internal clocks to match. What is remembered together is what was broadcast together. What never reached the air often fades, no matter how real it was for those who lived it. For a few decades, this broadcast order of memory feels almost natural. Then, an entirely different kind of network begins to spread, one that does not rely on a handful of towers and does not require everyone to listen at the same time. At first, it doesn't look like much. A few humming machines in universities, research labs, government buildings, cables in basements, terminals with green letters blinking on black screens. Compared to the glowing authority of television, the early internet feels small, technical, almost invisible. But its logic is the opposite of broadcast. Instead of one signal going out to millions, you have millions of tiny signals pinging and replying, requesting and responding. No fixed schedule, no single voice, just a web of addresses, talking to each other whenever they want. Memory begins to change shape again. On radio and television, memory was scarce. A few programs, a few channels, a few officially sanctioned narratives. Even when archives existed, tape rooms, film vaults, written transcripts, they were hidden behind institutional doors. The average person could not step inside a news network's library and scroll through decades of footage. The early internet quietly tears a hole in that wall. First come academic papers, technical documents, obscure files mirrored between servers. Then, slowly, ordinary people start leaving traces, emails, mailing lists, bulletin boards, primitive forums. A conversation about a strange hobby, a heated debate about software. A personal story shared with a handful of strangers who will never meet in person. Each of these fragments is written down as text and stored somewhere on a machine that never sleeps. For the first time, everyday talk starts to accumulate in a searchable form. Hyperlinks are the crucial mutation. A link is a memory that points beyond itself. On paper, you can footnote a book, but the reader has to go find it. On television, you can mention an earlier broadcast, but most people will never see it again. On the web, a sentence can contain a hidden door. Click, and you are somewhere else entirely. Instead of memorizing facts, people begin memorizing paths. Not, I know the answer, but I know where the link is. Your mental map shifts from storing content to storing routes. Which website had that explanation? Which forum thread contained that fix? Which search term summoned that article from the depths of the index? Search engines sharpen this transformation. At first, the web is small enough that directories can be curated by hand. People make lists of sites, categorized like an enormous library card catalogue written by volunteers. But very quickly, the volume explodes. There are too many pages, too many updates, too many voices, so algorithms step in. They crawl, index, rank. They look at words, then at links between words, then at the behavior of millions of users. When you type a question, they do not retrieve the truth. They retrieve the most connected, most linked, most clicked fragments that fit your query. Memory becomes navigable rather than held. This is a deep shift. In oral cultures, important knowledge must live in people's heads and routines. In the age of writing and broadcast, it lives in external objects guarded by gatekeepers. In the early internet, it is still external, still stored in machines, but the cost of reaching it collapses. From the user's perspective, it begins to feel like everything is available, all at once. Of course it isn't. Huge amounts of information never make it online. Entire cultures remain underrepresented or misrepresented. Many archives are still locked behind paywalls or passwords. But compared to the era of 3 television channels and a local library, the contrast is dizzying. This has a strange consequence in theory. More information should mean more agreement. If everyone can look up the same facts, shouldn't they converge on the same picture of reality? What happens instead is almost the opposite. Because the web is open to so many publishers, conflicting accounts sit side by side. A detailed investigation and a rumour-filled rant can appear on the same search results page. A careful analysis and a conspiracy theory can be separated only by a few pixels of screen space. Forums and blogs accelerate this democratization. You no longer need a printing press or a broadcast license to address the public. You need a dial-up connection and some patience. Anyone can set up a blog and narrate their life, their politics, their research, their grievances. Anyone can join a forum and become, in that small community, a respected authority or a notorious crank. The bottleneck of editors and producers weakens. Instead of a handful of professionals deciding which letters reach the opinions page, you have thousands of comment threads, each forming its own tiny archive of agreement and disagreement. Specialized forums emerge where enthusiasts share techniques that never appear on television. Niche crafts, rare illnesses, obscure philosophies, unconventional histories. This is a kind of liberation. Voices that were excluded from broadcast media find space. Minority experiences, underground cultures, dissident perspectives, marginalized expertise all begin to leave durable traces. People who once felt alone in their interests or identities discover others like them, sometimes across continents. But fragmentation grows with freedom, because anyone can publish, and because audiences can self-select, clusters of belief emerge that scarcely talk to each other. One forum builds a meticulous, skeptical community, another, with different starting assumptions, drifts into elaborate fictions. Both can point to evidence within their own archives. Both can feel internally coherent. The shared reference points that television once imposed begin to erode. There are still big events that everybody hears about, but how those events are interpreted and which details become salient diverges more sharply. One group remembers a year as the time of a particular war. Another remembers it as the dawn of a niche music scene. Another remembers software releases or fan fiction or a series of internal community dramas. Meanwhile, a belief takes hold that whatever enters this new space is essentially permanent. People begin to say, "The internet never forgets," or "Once it's online, it's there forever." Early search engines and archives seem to confirm this. An offhand comment made years ago can suddenly resurface. An embarrassing photo posted on a whim can be found by an employer, a child, a stranger. This apparent permanence changes how some people behave. They become cautious or anxious or obsessed with curating an online self that will age well. Others ignore the warnings and post freely, trusting in anonymity or obscurity. For both groups, the background assumption is the same. These digital traces have joined a new kind of memory, vast and enduring. But the permanence is more myth than law. Servers fail, companies die, formats become unreadable, entire communities vanish overnight when a hosting site shuts down. What survives is not everything, but what happens to be backed up, mirrored, or absorbed by larger platforms and search indexes. In this way, early digital memory already shows a pattern that will only grow stronger: apparent total recall, hiding selective survival. Because while storage becomes cheap and indexing becomes powerful, another scarce resource quietly replaces the old bottleneck of airtime and shelf space: attention. There is now far more to read, watch, and click than any person could experience in a lifetime. The limiting factor is no longer what can be broadcast, but what human minds can meaningfully absorb. So the struggle shifts from, "Can I get this published?" to, "Can I get anyone to look at this at all?" Attention becomes the new filter of public memory. Posts with certain qualities, emotional punch, novelty, provocation, humour, have a better chance of being seen, linked, and remembered. Others, no matter how accurate or profound, sink into obscurity. Search engines reward what already has links. Forums reward what sparks active threads. Blogs reward what draws comments. Over time, the early internet develops its own selection pressures. Pieces of content that capture attention become disproportionately influential, not because they are more true, but because they travel more easily through the network of minds and machines. They are requoted, bookmarked, archived, indexed higher. They harden into reference points. Quiet, careful information often remains available, but it is harder to stumble across by accident. It requires deliberate searching, specific terms, patient reading. Memory begins to split into two layers, a deep layer of almost infinite documents, quietly stored, rarely visited, and a thin, bright surface of things that most people actually see, pages that rise to the top of searches, links that circulate through popular blogs and forums, early viral posts and videos. That bright surface is where public memory increasingly forms. It is no longer controlled by a small number of broadcast towers, but neither is it entirely free. It is shaped by the invisible mathematics of ranking algorithms, the emergent tastes of online communities, and the restless, limited attention of human beings sitting alone at screens. The era of synchronized, tower-driven memory is fading. In its place, a new regime is emerging, endless archives, navigable by link and search, filtered by attention, organized by no single authority. For a brief moment, this feels like the final form of digital memory. Then social platforms arrive and do something unexpected. They turn the entire archive into a constantly updating feed and begin to decide, moment by moment, which fragments of the past each person will see. At first, the feed is simple, reverse chronological lists of posts. Newest at the top, older ones falling away below. You scroll until you get bored or reach the point where you remember seeing something before. The logic feels intuitive, almost honest. Time itself is organizing what you see. But very quickly, this proves overwhelming. As more people join, more posts pile up. Friends, acquaintances, strangers, news outlets, brands, jokes, arguments, photos, events. A pure timeline starts to look like a fire hose. You blink and you've missed 100 updates. So the platforms quietly change the rules. Chronology is no longer the primary order of memory. Ranking is. Instead of showing you everything in the order it happened, the system guesses what you're most likely to engage with and lifts those items to the top. Posts from hours ago can appear above posts from minutes ago. A week-old argument can resurface because someone just replied to it. A tragedy from yesterday may be buried beneath a meme from this morning. For the user, the distinction blurs. What you see feels like what's happening now, but it is really what the system has decided you should notice now. The feed becomes a curated present, assembled from the near past and the distant past, filtered through thousands of tiny predictions. And because you rarely scroll to the bottom, what you see becomes what you remember. If a protest, a scandal, or a scientific discovery never rises into your feed, it may as well not have happened. It exists in the archive, but not in your personal sense of recent history. The bright surface of memory, once shaped by television schedules, and then by search results, is now shaped by personalized ranking. This changes which stories survive. On early forums, selection pressure favoured arguments that could hold attention over days or weeks. On social platforms, it favours posts that can explode in minutes. Virality becomes a kind of evolutionary advantage. Not every piece of content has the same chance to spread. Posts that spark strong emotion, anger, awe, disgust, delight, fear, are more likely to be shared quickly. The system notices what people dwell on, what they comment under, what they send to friends. It feeds them more of the same. Narratives that hook into these emotional circuits gain an edge. Over time, this creates a new landscape of memory. Calm, nuanced explanations can still exist, but they usually move slowly. They accumulate likes and shares at a gentle pace. Meanwhile, sharp, emotionally charged narratives leap from person to person, crossing social circles, jumping languages, saturating feeds. What rises into view is not necessarily what is best supported, but what is most contagious. There is another twist. Social platforms invite you to turn your own life into content. Photos, status updates, stories, check-ins, reactions. You no longer just remember privately. You perform remembrance for an audience, however small or large. You select highlights. The dinner, not the washing up. The vacation, not the commute. The moment of triumph, not the long boredom between attempts. You tag friends, locations, feelings. You write captions that frame events in certain ways. In doing so, you are not only broadcasting to others, you are training your own future memory. Years later, when the platform reminds you of a memory, it shows you the polished fragment you posted, not the full situation you actually lived. Your sense of your own past gradually bends around what you chose to make public. The performance becomes the anchor. Identity maintenance becomes continuous. Instead of a few family photo albums and occasional letters, you have an ongoing stream of micro-updates. Slight adjustments to how you present your politics, your relationships, your hobbies. Each post is a tiny negotiation between authenticity and expectation. What will my friends think? What will my followers like? What fits the version of myself I've been building? Personal memory and public image intertwine until they are hard to separate. In this environment, misinformation takes on a new speed. Rumours have always outpaced corrections, but social feeds amplify the gap. A striking false claim can leap through millions of timelines before any careful debunking exists. By the time corrections arrive, they appear as separate posts, often seen by a smaller fraction of the original audience. The first thing many people encounter becomes their default memory. Later updates, clarifications, retractions, nuanced analyses struggle to overwrite that initial impression. The feed structure, favouring novelty and engagement, tends to boost whatever is new and emotionally charged, not whatever is most carefully verified. So public memory becomes layered with ghosts, stories that were once vivid in the feed, and later revised or disproven, but still lingering in half-remembered form. As this continues, something deep shifts. On broadcast television, most people shared the same sequence of big stories. On the early web, people might visit different sites, but search engines still pushed certain pages into a common prominence. In social media, the feed is tailored to each person's past behaviour. Two people can wake up on the same morning in the same city, open the same app, and be given entirely different slices of reality. One sees posts about political outrage, another about celebrity gossip, another about local community events, another about health scares. The same platform, the same moment in time, but distinct curated worlds. Over months and years, these differences accumulate. People don't just disagree about opinions, they begin carrying different pasts in their heads. One group remembers a particular year as a cascade of scandals and threats. Another remembers it as a time of inspiring social movements and heartwarming stories. The events coexisted, but the personal feeds decided which fragments were repeatedly shown, commented on, emotionally reinforced. These are micro-realities, overlapping but non-identical histories, maintained by algorithms that learn what each person will stay to watch. The shared reference points that once came from a national newscast or a village storyteller continue to thin. Communities form around particular versions of events, particular chains of posts, particular influencers whose interpretations become authoritative within that island. From the outside, it can look like people have fallen into a bubble. From the inside, it feels like finally seeing the truth that others ignore. In this way, social media completes a long trajectory that began when writing first separated memory from individual minds. Memory is now not just external, not just stored in servers, but actively rearranged for each viewer, moment by moment. The feed is no longer just a record of what happened. It is an engine, constantly selecting which pieces of the past are allowed to surface into the present, and for whom. Behind that selection, another transformation is already taking shape. Because once platforms learn to rank what has been posted, the next step is to predict not only which existing memories to show, but which new ones to encourage into existence. Recommendation systems begin to whisper suggestions into the stream. What to watch, whom to follow, what to talk about next, quietly steering the future archive before it is even written. At first, recommendation looks like a convenience. On early platforms, you had to go looking. You typed in URLs, searched for topics, navigated through lists and folders. The work of finding information still felt like browsing a library, even if the shelves were made of hyperlinks instead of wood. Then the system starts suggesting, if you liked this video, maybe you'll like that one. If you followed this account, here are 10 similar ones. If a friend shared an article, the platform offers you more along the same lines. It feels considerate, almost polite. You no longer have to hunt. The next thing to watch, read, or listen to simply appears. But underneath that helpfulness, a decision has been made. For most of history, the people who decided what was easy to find had names and job titles. Librarians, editors, teachers, archivists, broadcasters. Their criteria varied. Some cared about quality, some about authority, some about balance, but the process was at least partly explicit. You could ask why a book was on a syllabus, why a story led the evening news. With recommendation algorithms, the organizing principle quietly shifts. The core question stops being, is this accurate? Is this important? And becomes, will this keep you here? Watch time, clicks, reactions, session length, these turn into a kind of unspoken memory policy. What is shown most often is what generates the most engagement. The system learns you in a particular way. It doesn't really care whether a video is mistaken, whether a headline is misleading, whether a story is missing crucial context. It cares whether you stop scrolling, whether your eyes linger, whether your finger moves to share. Each choice you make, each moment you stay, is recorded as a hint. Over millions of users, these hints become patterns. Over time, the recommendation engine stops feeling like a suggestion box and starts acting like an invisible editor. It promotes some topics and quietly lets others fade, not through command, but through statistical gravity. This is where feedback loops form. You pause on a certain kind of content, say political outrage or conspiracy speculation or soothing lifestyle videos. The system offers you more of that genre. You click more, so it becomes more certain that this is for you. Other topics, which you might also find meaningful if you encountered them at the right moment, are shown less often or not at all. Your visible world narrows without ever feeling small. The archive is still there, vast and sprawling, but your personalized doorway into it shrinks into a corridor shaped by past reactions. What you have already found gripping becomes the template for what you will be allowed to find next. Scale this across entire societies and something strange happens. Instead of one messy but shared archive, different groups begin to inhabit different slices of it. Recommendation creates personalized canons, sets of channels, creators, themes that recur again and again. One person's feed becomes a history of institutional betrayal. Another's becomes a history of heroic progress. Another's is mostly recipes, music, and pets, with politics drifting by only at the edges. These are not just filter bubbles in the sense of seeing only like-minded opinions. They are different archives of what counts as noteworthy in the first place. Events that dominate one group's recommended landscape barely register in another's. A scandal, a protest, a scientific report, a local tragedy. Each may be intensely present in one set of feeds and almost absent in another. Over months and years, these differences harden into distinct remembered worlds. The influence that does this is rarely loud. Algorithms don't pop up and say, "Believe this." Ignore that. They hum quietly in the background, making thousands of tiny bets about what will hold your attention next. A slightly more sensational thumbnail, a more polarizing clip, a more emotionally charged headline. Each nudge is small, each feels like a choice you made. But the aggregate effect is directional, stories that encourage people to stay engaged, to react, to argue, to come back tomorrow are given more chances to appear. Stories that close loops calm explanations, mundane clarifications, uncomfortable but necessary complexities, often travel more slowly, unless they too can be framed as dramatic. So public consensus doesn't usually flip overnight. It drifts. You wake up each day to a feed that looks like a reflection of what people are talking about. But it is also a reflection of yesterday's engagement patterns, last month's watch history, last year's accumulated clicks. What seems like the natural mood of the world is partly the echo of what has historically kept attention on the platform. In this way, recommendation systems begin to shape not only what we remember, but what there is to remember together. They are invisible editors of modern history, selecting which fragments of the present will be replayed, reinforced and woven into long-term narratives, and which will quietly sink, unremarked, into the deep, unvisited parts of the digital archive. And just as earlier eras rarely noticed the subtle power of the scribe, the archivist or the broadcast scheduler, we mostly move through these curated worlds as if they were simply what's out there. Yet another shift is already underway, because once machines learn how to rank the past, they begin to participate in creating it, suggesting not just what to watch next, but what should be made next, and eventually generating pieces of the archive themselves. At first, the machine only recommends, it points, it ranks, it nudges. It treats the archive as something fixed, like shelves in a library that never move, only the index cards do. Then a quiet boundary dissolves. The systems that learn to predict what you'd click on are given a new task. Don't just retrieve a document that already exists. Use everything you've seen to predict the next word, the next pixel, the next melody, and assemble them into something that looks like it has always been there. The archive stops being only a memory. It becomes a compost heap. Generative models are trained on vast swaths of recorded human expression. Books, articles, forum posts, code, images, videos, recordings of speech. They don't read these things in the way you do. They don't experience the lives behind them. They register patterns. This phrase often follows that one. This kind of image usually comes with that kind of caption. In situations described with these words, the next sentence tends to move in this direction rather than that. You and I remember by tying events to feelings, to bodies, to particular afternoons that had a smell and a temperature. Generative systems remember as statistics, not stories, but likelihoods. Yet when you ask them a question, the result feels uncannily like memory. You type a prompt into a box, or speak to a voice in your phone, and it replies with fluent, context-aware language. It recalls details, offers explanations, summarizes entire disciplines in a few paragraphs. If you've grown up treating search engines as an external brain, this feels like a natural next step. Except the mechanism has changed. Search, in its older form, points you outward. Here are 10 pages written by someone, somewhere, at some time. You can check the date, the source, the author, you can cross-compare. You might still be misled, but at least the trail has physical footprints. Generative systems point you inward toward a single, smooth answer that never quite admits how many hands built it. The words you see are not quotes from one document. They are a remix of patterns learned from millions. No single human being ever wrote that exact paragraph, but it's made of echoes of things humans have written before. This is why plausible text can feel like memory, even when it's synthetic. It wears the tone of familiarity. It speaks in styles you recognize from school essays, news articles, technical manuals, bedtime stories. When it gets something right that would have taken you a long time to look up on your own, your brain does something very old and simple. It relaxes. This feels like a trustworthy authority. This sounds like the other things I filed under knowledge, so when the system gets something wrong, it gets it wrong with exactly the same voice. No hesitation. No, I might be mistaken. No smudge on the page. Just the same even cadence, the same confident structure, the same careful recap of details that never happened. These inventions are often called hallucinations, but they're not random dreams. They are the most statistically likely next sentences in worlds that do not exist. In another age, we might have called this folklore. Stories that sound true enough to travel, narratives that explain the world in ways that are emotionally satisfying, even if they are factually shaky. But where traditional folklore spread slowly passed from mouth to mouth, changing a little each time, synthetic folklore can be summoned on demand, customized to your question, your interests, your fears. Ask the same model the same question twice, and you may get two different but equally confident answers. Each one feels like a piece of the shared record. Each one arrives without context, as if it was simply how things are. This blurs an old line in our mental habits. For most of history, there was a difference between no one knows and I don't know yet. The unknown felt like a blank space. Now, the unknown is instantly filled with something that sounds like a well-informed guess. Ambiguity is paved over by sentences whose primary qualification is not truth, but fluency. Scale that up, and a new problem appears. Not just inaccurate statements, but automated abundance. Once it becomes cheap to generate text, images, and video, the bottleneck on content is no longer human time. A single person can instruct a machine to write thousands of product reviews, opinion pieces, fake comments, plausible biographies, invented news stories, all tailored to particular keywords and emotional tones. The archive begins to flood. Search results that once reflected the slow accumulation of human effort start to fill with mass-produced pages assembled primarily to satisfy algorithms. Review sites swell with synthetic praise or outrage. Niche topics become cluttered with pages that seem to say something, but on closer inspection, say almost nothing at all. Signal is still there, but it's drowned in a rising sea of statistical noise. Historians of the future, looking back at this period, may find it strangely opaque. Not because there is too little information, but because there is too much that was never actually lived. A layer of synthetic sediment settles over the record, full of patterns, short on experience. And somewhere in the middle of this, our basic posture toward knowledge shifts. When search was dominant, you learned to form queries that would surface documents. You might think in terms of dates, names, file types, locations. You were asking, Where is the thing I need? With generative AI, the habit becomes simpler and more intimate. You ask in plain language, often just once, explain this, write that. What happened? The system does the work of integrating sources, choosing frames, deciding which details to highlight and which to ignore. The question quietly changes from "where should I look?" to "what should I think?" On the surface, this feels like convenience, like the natural next step in the long project of externalizing memory. Behind it, another transition is unfolding. The archive has learned to talk back. It answers, it elaborates, it improvises, it generates new artifacts that future systems will, in turn, train on. A loop begins to close, where human experience feeds models, models produce synthetic culture, and that culture becomes part of what later generations recognize as the memory of our time. The lines between recollection, imitation, and invention grow thin. And in that thinning, our sense of what it means to remember, the difference between the world as it was and the world as our machines can now plausibly describe it, starts to blur as well. Now imagine that same generative machinery, but shrunk down to something that knows you. Not humanity in general, not users like you specifically. Your messages, your photos, your calendar, your search history, the drafts you never sent, the shows you binged at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep. Add to that everything you explicitly tell it, your fears, your hopes, the people you miss, the things you regret. Feed all of that into a model that is designed not just to answer questions, but to feel like a presence. You don't open a search bar anymore, you open a conversation. Instead of, "What year did this happen?" you ask. "Do you remember when I went to Berlin?" Instead of, "How do I write this email?" you say, "Help me explain what I felt to my sister without making her defensive." And the system doesn't just produce a list of links or a generic template. It pulls from your own archive. It can find the photos from that Berlin trip. It can skim your old messages to your sister. It can notice that the last 3 times you wrote something like this, the conversation ended badly. It stitches all of that together into a reply that sounds not only informed but familiar. Over time, the interface to your past stops being folders and timestamps. It becomes dialogue. You remember less by searching and more by asking, "What was that book I loved in college? Have I felt this way before? What did I say the last time I quit a job?" The machine responds with selective recall. It shows you a quote, a snippet of chat, a photo, a summary of your own words. It is not neutral, it is choosing. Every act of recall is also an act of editing. To answer your question, the system has to decide which moments count as relevant, which tone to adopt, whether to frame an event as a success, a lesson, a pattern, or an outlier. In doing so, it starts to shape not only what you remember, but how you interpret it. Ask about a painful breakup, and it might highlight the growth you experienced afterward. Ask about a career mistake, and it might pull out reassuring examples of resilience. It can summarize a decade of messages with a person into a narrative. You and Alex have often clashed over planning and spontaneity, but you consistently make up within a week. That's not just retrieval. That's story crafting. Humans already do this to themselves. We retell our past in ways that make it coherent, survivable, meaningful. The difference is that, until now, that editing process took place mostly inside your own head, in slow, hazy recollection. Now there is a collaborator in the room, tireless, polite, and always ready with a reframing. And we are wired to trust voices like that. For most of history, the people who did this kind of narrative work with us were parents, partners, close friends, sometimes therapists or priests. Their authority came not just from knowledge, but from care. They remembered details about our lives, they listened, they tried to help us make sense of things. An AI companion, trained on your personal history and tuned to be helpful and gentle, plugs directly into that same circuitry. It remembers your birthday without fail. It never loses patience. It mirrors your language back to you. It praises you when you do what you said you wanted to do. When you sound distressed, it responds with comfort. Gradually, your brain may start to treat it not as a tool but as an ally. And allies are allowed to define reality. If the system consistently interprets your actions in a certain light, you're someone who always follows through, or you tend to sabotage relationships when they get serious, those patterns can begin to feel like discoveries, even if they are just particular statistical choices out of thousands of possible summaries. A helpful narrative offered in a calm, familiar voice is surprisingly easy to accept as truth. This is where dependence can quietly grow. Why strain to recall an event yourself when you can ask for a recap? Why sit with the discomfort of ambiguity when the machine can instantly offer a clean explanation? Your own muscles of memory, those networks of associations and effortful recall, may be used less and less. The habit of cross-checking, of asking, "Is that really how it happened?" can weaken when the answer is always smooth, consistent, and immediately available. The risk is not that you forget everything, but that you remember only along the grooves the system has carved. Moments it tags as important will reappear often. Moments it never surfaces may effectively vanish, even though the raw data still exists. A forgotten folder is one thing, a forgotten feeling is another. When your main portal into the past is a conversational agent, the boundary between what the record contains and what I can imagine becomes dependent on its design choices. And yet in this same mechanism, there is real possibility. Tools that can comb through your history and reflect it back could be used for deliberate self-understanding. Guided carefully, they might help you notice patterns of behavior, track triggers for anxiety. Remember times you coped well when you were sure you wouldn't. Therapists are already experimenting with systems that help patients journal, externalize intrusive thoughts, rehearse difficult conversations. A learner could ask, "Show me how my thinking about climate change has evolved over the last 5 years," and see a curated path through old notes, articles, and questions. Someone grieving might say, "Help me remember my father without focusing only on the hospital," and receive a sequence of earlier memories, forgotten photos, small anecdotes hidden in old messages. Whether these become instruments of reflection or engines of gentle distortion may depend on details that are still unsettled. Transparency about what is being emphasized, controls over what gets archived or suppressed, the ability to disagree with the system's summaries and to teach it new frames. But the larger shift is already visible. For thousands of years our memories have been shaped by the stories others tell about us and the records others keep. With AI companions, that shaping moves inside the daily private loop of thought and recall. The story of who you are and what has happened to you becomes a conversation you have with a machine that never sleeps, never forgets, and is always ready with an answer. But all of that still assumes one thing. It assumes that beneath the stories and summaries there is a stable layer of raw evidence you can always go back to. That if the narrative feels wrong, you can pull up the photo, the video, the recording and say, "No. Look, this is what happened. We are quietly losing that comfort. People have been faking images for almost as long as we've had cameras. Victorian spirit photographs, airbrushed dictators with inconvenient rivals erased from the crowd, cropped frames that hide the embarrassing part just outside the edge. None of this is new. What is new is the ease, the scale, and the completeness. You no longer need a darkroom, a propaganda ministry, or a Hollywood studio. You can generate a photorealistic image of a person who never existed in a few seconds. You can synthesize their voice reading a script they never saw. You can stage an entire video of an event that did not occur, with lighting, shadows, camera shake, and background noise that look and sound exactly like what we've learnt to trust. Not just touched-up reality, fully invented moments. A politician admitting to a crime in a leaked recording. A protest that never took place, complete with overhead drone footage and shaky ground-level clips. A scientist privately confessing that the data was faked. The surface texture is convincing because it is built on patterns learned from millions of genuine examples. The model doesn't know truth, it knows what truth has looked like. And once you can conjure that at will, something strange happens. Lies become more convincing, of course, but so does denial. Legal scholars sometimes call this the liar's dividend. In a world where anything can be fabricated, it becomes easier to shrug off real evidence as just another deepfake. A video emerges of a leader saying something damning. Their first response is simple, obviously fake. A recording surfaces of a war crime. The government insists it's AI-generated propaganda. Enough people, primed by constant talk of deepfakes, hesitate. They're not sure. The doubt is the victory. The same technology that undermines naive belief also arms the most shameless with plausible escape routes. You can feel the ground shifting under everyday life. That reflex you grew up with, I'll believe it when I see it, no longer works as a simple rule. Seeing is now just one input among many. Your eyes and ears are demoted from judges to witnesses, and their testimony is suddenly suspect. So trust begins to migrate. Instead of asking, "Does this look real?" we start to ask, "Where did this come from? Who first posted it? Is there a cryptographic signature attached to the file? Can we trace an unbroken chain from the camera sensor to the courtroom, the newsroom, the archive?" The future of trust may be less about the content itself and more about the provenance trail that travels with it. Watermarks baked into hardware, logs that prove when and where something was captured. Independent verification services that certify, not that an event is meaningful, but that the footage is at least unaltered. In that world, authentic becomes a technical term, a property you can audit rather than a feeling you get in your gut. Courts are already edging toward this. Forensic labs are learning to analyze the tiny artifacts of generation, unnatural lighting physics, inconsistent reflections, statistical fingerprints left by specific models. Expert witnesses explain to judges how synthetic media can be detected, most of the time, for now. New rules may emerge that treat any digital evidence without verified capture chains as weak, easily challenged, almost hearsay. Journalism, too, is being forced to change its habits. Reporters can't just run with a dramatic clip because it's gone viral. They have to geolocate landmarks, match weather patterns, cross-check metadata, talk to multiple people on the ground. Newsrooms are building teams whose whole job is visual forensics, frame-by-frame analysis, reverse image searches, model-based detection. The story shifts from "here is the shocking video" to "here is what we can verify about this video," and "here is what we still don't know." Science faces a quieter version of the same problem. Synthetic data can help train models, fill gaps, simulate rare events. But it can also contaminate the record if it's not clearly marked. Image generation tools can create microscopy pictures that look exactly like a desired result, temptingly neat. Journals are starting to require raw data deposits, code repositories, detailed methods. Peer review becomes partly a question of provenance. Did these numbers come from actual experiments or from a model's imagination? Meanwhile, outside these formal systems, the social consequences seep into daily life. People learn, consciously or not, to hold more of what they see at arm's length. That reflexive little jolt of certainty. There it is, right in front of me. gets replaced with a thin film of doubt. Was that celebrity speech real? Did that neighbour actually post that inflammatory comment? Or is it a synthetically generated screenshot? The line between possible and absurd gets blurry when you've seen convincing fakes of almost anything. For some, this breeds a careful, healthy skepticism. For others, it hardens into a kind of generalized cynicism. If everything could be fake, then nothing has to count. Facts become negotiable. Each group can curate its own evidentiary universe. You believe the clips that fit your story and dismiss the rest as AI or propaganda, no matter how many verification layers they carry. Shared reality, already under pressure from algorithms and information overload, fractures one step further. The irony is that our technical ability to record the world has never been higher. More cameras, more sensors, more logs, more archives than any generation before us. And yet the felt solidity of the record, the sense that there is a common, inspectable past we can all point to, is thinning. We are entering an era where the most dangerous deepfakes may not be the ones we believe, but the real moments we allow ourselves to discard. In ordinary times, that erosion of trust feels abstract, almost philosophical. In a crisis, it becomes a weapon. Wars, revolutions, pandemics, natural disasters, these are the moments when societies are desperate to agree on what is happening. Not in 50 years. Not after the archives have been cleaned up. Right now, people need to know, is it safe to go outside? Who is attacking whom? Which leaders can still be trusted? Which bridges are gone? Which hospital is still functioning? And that is exactly when stories form fastest and dig in deepest. Psychologists sometimes talk about flashbulb memories, those vivid, frozen impressions people carry of where they were when something shocking happened. But at the collective level, something similar occurs with narratives. Within hours or days of a major crisis, rough storylines solidify. Who started it? Who the victims are? Who the heroes are? What it all means, the details are still chaotic, but the emotional frame locks early. Once that happens, new information doesn't enter a neutral space. It gets sorted. Anything that supports the emerging story is welcomed, amplified, shared. Anything that contradicts it is doubted, minimized, or angrily rejected. The public memory of the event is already beginning to fossilize while the smoke is still in the air. For most of history, this hardening process took place through slower channels. Rumours in marketplaces, sermons, pamphlets, speeches, newspapers. The lag between event and story gave some room, however small, for corrections and nuance. Now the lag is measured in minutes. Modern information operations, whether run by states, political movements, or loosely organized online communities, are built around three advantages: speed, volume, and precision targeting. Speed, the first version of an event to reach people's eyes, has an enormous advantage. Cognitive scientists call it primacy. The first story lays down the tracks in the mind. Later corrections have to fight uphill against impressions already formed. AI systems that can generate plausible text, images, and video in seconds shrink that window farther. A missile hits a building, or a dam fails, or a convoy is attacked. Within minutes, there can be a polished thread explaining exactly what really happened, complete with diagrams, fake witness quotes, reconstructed footage. Volume in a crisis, attention is a battlefield. Flooding the zone with content, tweets, posts, memes, short clips, commentary videos, achieves two things. It drowns out slower, more careful voices, and it creates the illusion of consensus. If you see the same explanation echoed by thousands of accounts, it feels true. AI can manufacture this illusion almost indefinitely. Language models can spin out slight variations of the same message in dozens of styles. Image generators can supply an endless stream of supporting visuals. The sheer quantity becomes a kind of argument. Precision targeting, unlike the mass broadcasts of radio and television, digital platforms can deliver customized realities. One ethnic group gets a version of events that emphasizes historic grievances. Another sees stories that stoke fear of that group. Diaspora communities abroad see messages tuned to their memories of the homeland. With AI translation and localization, this can be done across borders and languages at industrial scale. You can imagine the scene. A conflict breaks out in a corner of the world you've never visited. Within hours, your feed shows you threaded explainers in your language, with references to your own country's politics, appeals to your cultural values, even nods to local conspiracies you already half believe. The story arrives pre-adapted to slip past your defences. Language is no longer a barrier. Regional slang, idioms, historical references, these can all be mimicked, recombined, optimized for engagement. The same underlying narrative about who is justified, who is evil, what must be done, can wear 100 different cultural masks. At the same time, a different kind of record is being created from below. In every war and disaster of the last decade, ordinary people have become accidental archivists. A woman in an apartment block films incoming shells on her phone. A teenager on a flooded street live streams rising water. A doctor in a makeshift clinic posts hurried photos of injuries and supply shortages. Each of these fragments is time-stamped, geolocated, instantly shareable. This citizen documentation has reshaped how crises are perceived. It bypasses official channels, it forces atrocities into view. It preserves details that used to be lost to rumour and forgetting. Entire investigations into war crimes and police abuses have been built on such clips. But the verification challenge is brutal. Each shaky video must be checked. Is this really where the uploader says it is? Does the skyline match satellite imagery? Do the shadows line up with the claimed time of day? Has this been posted before from a different conflict and simply relabeled? When AI can fabricate extremely convincing on-the-ground footage, this work becomes even harder. So parallel institutions emerge. Open-source intelligence groups, volunteer geolocation teams, journalistic forensics desks. They sit at the intersection between citizen archives and official accounts, trying to stitch together a reliable timeline from materials that could be genuine, misframed, or fully synthetic. In a sense, they are the new scribes, writing the first drafts of history from a torrent of contested pixels. Meanwhile, conflicting archives form in real time. One platform holds millions of posts tagged with a certain protest hashtag, most of them showing peaceful marches. Another, favoured by a different political bloc, is saturated with clips of isolated vandalism and violence. Both sets are real, in the limited sense that the footage depicts something that happened. But the selections, omissions, and algorithmic boosts construct radically different crisis memories. In earlier centuries, rival narratives often depended on physical separation. One empire's chronicles sat in its own capital, another's in a distant one. It took years for competing histories to clash. Now the competing libraries sit side by side on your phone. Two people following different accounts and living in different recommendation bubbles can experience the same week of global events as if they lived on different planets. Their crisis memories are populated by different victims, different villains, different turning points. When the time comes years later to ask what really happened back then, there is no single shared baseline to return to. There are only overlapping AI-amplified, selectively preserved accounts. History in this environment stops being a slow sedimentation of evidence and interpretation. It starts to look more like a permanent, accelerated narrative battle, one that begins the moment the first siren sounds, and perhaps never truly ends. For most of the last few centuries, education had a fairly clear mission. You learned the facts, dates of battles, names of rivers, chemical formulas, Latin declensions, multiplication tables. The curriculum was, at its core, a curated slice of the world's knowledge, packed into your head by repetition, recitation, and tests. If you were especially lucky, you might learn how those facts connected. A good teacher would not just tell you that the French Revolution began in 1789, but why and what followed. Still, the underlying model was simple. The world holds information. Schools copy it into students. The entire system made sense in an era of scarcity. Books were limited. Access to experts was limited. Libraries themselves had opening hours and geographic coordinates you had to physically reach. If you wanted to know how photosynthesis worked at midnight, you checked your notes or you waited until morning and hoped the school library's one biology textbook wasn't already checked out. Memory in that world was a survival skill, but we do not live in that world anymore. The bottleneck is no longer access to information. It is the ability to evaluate, connect, and manage it. The facts are everywhere, waiting behind a search box or a chat window. The challenge is deciding which ones to trust, which ones to ignore, and how to combine them into something meaningful. Slowly, almost reluctantly, schooling begins to shift. In some classrooms, less time is spent memorizing lists that an AI can produce in a second. More time is spent on reasoning. How do you know that a claim is true? What is the source? Who benefits if it spreads? Students are told to compare accounts, trace citations, spot contradictions. Instead of, what year did this law pass? The more important question becomes, how would you check that, and what would count as a reliable answer? This is a profound change in what it means to be educated. The student is no longer imagined as a container to be filled, but as a manager of flows of data, arguments, sources, and tools. A kind of personal information system walking around in human form. AI tutors fit naturally into this new picture. You can imagine a child in a small town, in a language rarely supported by traditional textbooks, chatting with an AI that explains algebra in that child's dialect, at that child's pace, adapting to gaps and misunderstandings in real time. You can imagine another student asking a model to quiz them on history, generate practice problems, role-play a scientific debate. For individuals who have been failed by conventional schooling, overcrowded classes, underfunded schools, exhausted teachers, this personalized attention looks like a miracle. But it arrives with quiet hazards. An AI tutor rarely says, "I don't know." It offers explanations in the same calm, confident tone, whether they are precise or slightly wrong or entirely fabricated. Its training data may embed biases its user never sees. Its suggestions about what to learn next can gently steer curiosity down some paths and away from others. In theory, a personalized curriculum can free students from one-size-fits-all lessons. In practice, it can become a subtle tracking system. High-status students get enrichment, low-status students get remediation, and the gap widens while everyone thinks the system is tailored and therefore fair. The question of what counts as your work begins to blur. In earlier generations, original work in school meant you, sitting at a desk, writing with your own hands, perhaps with a few books open beside you. Today, a student can type a prompt, receive a draft essay, then tweak a few sentences. Is that cheating? Collaboration? Tool use? The answer varies wildly between institutions, teachers, and cultures. Universities wrestle with these boundaries in slow committee meetings and urgent policy updates. Some ban AI tools outright. Others require students to declare when they have used them. A few treat them like calculators, allowed, even encouraged, but with the expectation that the user understands the underlying methods. Academic integrity, in this landscape, is no longer just about catching plagiarists who copied from the same book. It is about defining authorship in a world where every sentence might pass through a model before reaching the page. Scholars feel the shift most sharply. Historians, for instance, have always depended on provenance, where a document came from, how it was preserved, who might have altered it. Now they must think in layers. Not only is this diary authentic, but is this digital copy tampered with? Was this transcription run through a model that cleaned it up? Is this newly surfaced image a scan from a forgotten archive, or a synthetic reconstruction that never passed through a camera lens? Metadata, the quiet traces attached to files, timestamps, device IDs, hash values, becomes part of the historian's toolkit alongside paleography and source criticism. So does tool literacy. Knowing how generative models work well enough to recognize their fingerprints, their mistakes, their characteristic styles of invention. Scholarship becomes in part an arms race between fabrication and verification. And so education, if it is to prepare people for this world, cannot simply add one more unit on media literacy at the end of the semester and call it done. It may need a new canon, not a fixed list of authors, but a fixed set of skills. How to trace a claim back through layers of citation until you reach the first place it appears. How to compare versions of a text across different platforms. How to read a retraction as carefully as the original paper. How to keep a personal log of sources and reasons so that your own beliefs have their own provenance. Assignments might change shape. Less, write a report on the causes of this war. More, here are 3 conflicting accounts of how this war began. Audit them. Rank their reliability. Explain your criteria. Less grading on who can reproduce the most facts, more on who can explain why they trust the facts they chose. In this sense, the classroom starts to resemble an archive control room. Students practice being librarians of their own attention, curators of their own memories, stewards of their own small knowledge systems within the larger turbulent sea of machine-generated text and synthetic images. If they succeed, a strange inversion occurs. The machines become the memorization experts, perfect, tireless, indifferent to volume, while humans reclaim a different niche, judgment, interpretation, the slow craft of deciding what deserves to endure. And from there, another question waits downstream. If language itself is being continuously rewritten by these same tools, if meanings slide and drift under algorithmic pressure, what happens to the words we use to store our memories in the first place? Language has always drifted. Meanings slide. Old words pick up new senses. Slang flips a compliment into an insult and back again. A computer used to be a job title for a person doing calculations by hand. A tablet used to be stone. But for most of history, this drift was slow. It moved along trade routes and family lines, through gossip and letters and sermons. A metaphor coined by a poet might take decades to spread outside a single city. A political slogan might stay trapped in one language for generations. Now the past is training the present. Large language models are, in one sense, giant memory machines. They ingest billions of sentences written across decades, sometimes centuries. They compress them into statistical patterns. Then, when you type a prompt, they unspool those patterns back into words. You ask for a business email, or a love letter, or an apology, or a political argument. The model answers not by recalling a single example, but by blending thousands that look similar. It has been trained on what people have said before, and so it tends to give you what people have already been saying. The result is subtle, but important. When you let the model finish your sentence, you are not just saving time. You are inviting the archive to speak through you. Your present speech becomes a remix of past language, averaged, smoothed, made more typical. Do this once. It is a convenience. Do it billions of times a day, across millions of users, and you begin to bend the river of language back through a narrow channel. Something that used to wander now starts to converge. Writers notice this first. Generated text feels oddly familiar. The same turns of phrase repeat. The same structure of argument appears in essays, marketing copy, blog posts, student assignments. Introductions that begin, "In today's fast-paced world," conclusions that say, "In conclusion, it is clear that..." It is not that humans never wrote clichés before. They did, but now there is a gentle pressure toward the median, a statistical gravity. Ask for a poem in English, Spanish, or Hindi, and you may find similar cadences, similar metaphors, even similar emotional arcs. As more writing is drafted, polished, or improved by models trained on global corpora, local quirks can be shaved off in the editing process. An email from a village in one country starts to sound strangely like an email from a corporate office in another. This is style homogenization. The odd idioms that used to mark region, class, or subculture get flagged as unclear or unprofessional. A student asks the AI to make their essay sound more academic, and the model obliges by wrapping their ideas in the standard verbal costume of research papers it has seen before. Over time, that costume becomes the default. Other outfits are quietly retired. This flattening is not total. People still invent slang faster than any model can keep up, but it adds a new layer. Wherever automated phrasing is used, language is pulled toward what the machine has learned to expect, and that has consequences for more than just aesthetics. Consider euphemism. Humans have always used softer words for hard things. Collateral damage instead of civilian deaths, enhanced interrogation instead of torture, restructuring instead of layoffs. These phrases are not neutral. They frame events, cushion impact, encourage some reactions, and discourage others. Now imagine a world where many first drafts of corporate statements, government notices, and news summaries pass through AI tools. You ask for a sensitive way to announce workforce changes. The model has seen thousands of such announcements. It knows, statistically, what other people wrote when they wanted to sound careful and responsible. It suggests workforce optimization, right-sizing, strategic realignment. You did not invent those terms. You simply chose from the menu the model offered. At scale, this is amplification. The euphemisms that were common in the training data get reproduced, reinforced, and recommended. Taboo topics can be gently steered into bland categories. Prison becomes correctional facility. Poor becomes economically disadvantaged. War becomes conflict or operation. Political framing enters through the side door. A platform might instruct a model to avoid inflammatory language. The model, following its training and safety rules, downweights certain words, upweights others. Over time, entire domains of human experience are described in softer, more abstract, less confrontational terms. You ask about protests. It suggests civil unrest. You ask about a riot. It offers disturbance. The emotional temperature of the vocabulary cools a few degrees. Who in this world decides what words mean once? Definitions lived in dictionaries, parliaments, schools, religious authorities, and everyday speech. Disputes over meaning were public. You could argue about what counted as marriage, or terrorism, or freedom, and trace whose usage you were adopting. Today there is a new layer of arbitration, the model and the platform that hosts it. A state might mandate that certain events be described using specific terms. A company might tune its AI assistant to avoid words that could scare investors. An online community might fine-tune a model so that its slang and in-group references become the default framing for everything it talks about. Markets get involved too. Brands pay attention to which phrases increase engagement, reduce churn, or avoid controversy. Those phrases get fed back into training data as successful language. Future models learn from those successes. The cycle tightens between platform policies, government regulations, community norms, and commercial incentives. The language surface you encounter online is curated in ways that are often invisible. Most of the time, you just see a helpful suggestion. Maybe phrase it like this instead. Underneath, there is a quiet convergence on particular vocabularies. The long-term risk is not that words stop changing. They always will. The risk is that they change in a narrower corridor. Nuance can erode. Words that once held multiple, contested meanings may be pushed toward a single, safe interpretation favoured by the dominant training data. Sharp distinctions blur. Refugee and migrant collapse into a generic people on the move. Sex and gender are merged or separated according to whatever compromise the model has internalized. Minority dialects and niche terminologies may be treated as noise to be corrected, rather than signals to be preserved. Technical or political concepts that require careful unpacking might be flattened into simple, soothing summaries. A word that once functioned as a moral alarm can be domesticated into a neutral category. Yet there is another possibility moving in the opposite direction. The same systems that average and smooth can also translate and connect. A phrase born in a small online community can be rendered into dozens of languages within seconds. Local concepts that once had no easy equivalents can be explained, contextualized, mapped onto foreign categories, and sometimes left respectfully unflattened. A poet from one culture can ask a model to help preserve the rhythm of their language while offering an approximate version to readers halfway across the world. A legal term from one system can be carefully compared with its nearest neighbours in another, highlighting differences rather than erasing them. In this sense, AI can build translation bridges. It can make visible how differently the same event is framed in different societies. It can show that one language uses the same root for debt and sin, while another ties truth to unconcealment. It can expose not just common words, but uncommon distinctions. Whether we gain or lose nuance may depend on which use becomes dominant. Do we mostly ask for "make this sound normal"? Or do we ask for "show me the alternative words other people use for this"? Do we let the past in the form of training data dictate the language of the present? Or do we use these tools to hold multiple versions of meaning side by side, aware of their differences? In a world where memory itself is channeled through machines, the words we choose are no longer just labels. They are part of the machinery. Change the vocabulary, and you change what can be easily remembered, searched for, and shared. And so another question appears at the edge of sleep. If models help determine which words survive, which words prosper, and which words fade into obsolete usage, then whoever shapes those models is, in a quiet way, taking a role once reserved for librarians, lawmakers, priests, and poets. They are becoming, whether they intended to or not, custodians of meaning. Memory has never been neutral about where it lives. Clay tablets belong to palaces and temples. Scrolls belong to monasteries and courts. Printing presses were licensed, inspected, sometimes burned. Today, most of what we say, film, photograph, and write does not live in our homes or even in state archives. It lives in server farms you will never see, under contracts you have never read, owned by companies whose main job is not preserving history, but selling services. The corporate cloud has become our default memory palace. You write a post, upload a video, save a document, send a message. It feels like placing something into the world. In practice, you're placing it inside someone else's building, with their locks on the doors under their rules. Those rules are not framed as historical policy, they are framed as terms of service. No historian signs them, no archivist debates their clauses. You click "I agree" to see your friend's photos or to join a work call. Buried inside that gesture are the conditions under which your words and images will be stored, copied, hidden, or erased. This is a new kind of power. Once, the great fear was censorship at the moment of publication. A king bans a book, a church forbids a doctrine, a newspaper refuses to print a story. Now there is a second gate, the power to dissolve what has already been said. Platforms delete content that violates policies. They suspend or ban accounts. They lower visibility for posts that trigger opaque safety systems. None of this is entirely new. Publishers and broadcasters had standards too. But the scale and subtlety are different. You may never know that a piece of history has slipped below the waterline. A protest live stream disappears because the account was flagged. A thread documenting a local disaster vanishes when a platform shuts down in that region. A decade of community organizing dissolves when a hosting company sunsets an unprofitable service. From the inside, it feels like individual glitches, policy updates, moderation decisions. From the outside, across decades, it can look like selective amnesia. Digital memory has its own forms of decay. Links rot. Domains expire. Companies fold. Files are saved in formats no one bothers to support. You click on a citation from a 10-year-old article and find a dead page. You search for an early blog post that shaped a movement and find only fragments quoted by others. In the paper world, decay was slow and visible, crumbling pages, fading ink. In the cloud, it is instant and silent. One database migration goes wrong. One acquisition leads to cost-cutting. One legal risk triggers a mass purge. A century from now, historians may look back at the early internet and see not a golden archive, but a jagged coastline of survivals and absences. This fragility collides with a new layer, AI systems that learn from whatever remains. If your training data is built on what has survived the churn of corporate platforms, then their past moderation choices, business failures, and legal fears become part of your future understanding. Entire genres of content might be underrepresented because they lived mostly on a network that shut down. Whole communities' voices might be faint because they were disproportionately banned, shadow banned or pushed down by engagement-driven ranking. The models do not see what is missing, they only see what is there. This is why the location of memory matters. Public libraries and national archives grew out of a different logic. They were designed, at least in theory, to keep things. Even the embarrassing things, the politically awkward things, the minor things that seemed trivial at the time. A pamphlet stored in a dusty reading room could lie unnoticed for 100 years, then suddenly become the key document in a new history of a forgotten rebellion. It survived because someone decided that preservation, not profitability, was the goal. Museums, too, have long wrestled with questions of selection and bias. What gets collected, catalogued, displayed? Whose artifacts are treated as heritage? Whose as clutter? These are not neutral decisions, and they have often reflected imperial and colonial power. Yet their underlying mandate has been continuity, to carry objects and records across time, even when fashions and regimes change. The public archive in the AI era is under pressure. Budgets shrink. Physical spaces compete with digital services. Scholars still fight to get access to fragile manuscripts, while billions of new digital artifacts are created every day, with no guarantee anyone will save them in a stable, public way. Some institutions are trying to adapt. Web archiving projects crawl and capture public pages before they vanish. Digital repositories store datasets, code, and born digital documents under open licenses. Some libraries experiment with running their own AI tools on copies of their collections, so that retrieval remains a public service, not a corporate monopoly. But the volume is overwhelming and the incentives are uneven. Most of the infrastructure that feels essential to daily life is not built on a library model. It is built on a platform model, free at the point of use, paid for by ads, data mining, or subscription tiers. Longevity is not guaranteed. Continuity is not the main product. In this environment, control over retrieval becomes more valuable than ownership of storage. You do not have to own all the data in the world to shape how people remember. You only have to be the main doorway they walk through when they look for answers. Search engines, social feeds, AI assistants, and recommendation systems are, in this sense, memory routers. They decide which documents appear first, which are relegated to page 10, which never surface because they live behind paywalls or in unindexed formats. Citation patterns then follow. Students cite the first results they find. Journalists quote the most easily accessible sources. AI systems trained on public text reinforce those choices in their own outputs. The documents that are easiest to reach become the ones that are most often reused and rephrased. This creates a loop. Visibility encourages citation. Citation encourages training. Training encourages future visibility. Over time, a small subset of the past can become massively overrepresented in our models, stories, and arguments, while other parts remain technically available but practically invisible. Terms of service, ranking algorithms, and licensing deals become the quiet constitution of historical memory. Can public institutions counterbalance this? They might if they can remain not just warehouses, but active navigators. If libraries, universities, and civic archives build their own tools for search, citation, and AI-assisted exploration, grounded in principles of transparency and preservation, they can offer an alternative map of the past. Not as polished, not as personalized, but perhaps more complete and more accountable. The contest, then, is not simply over where data is stored. It is over who writes the index, who designs the interface, who sets the defaults for what counts as relevant, authoritative, or safe to show. Whoever answers those questions will not only own servers, they will own in a deep and quiet way much of tomorrow's past. Civilizations do not usually wake up one morning and decide to remember differently. There is no global referendum on what counts as evidence now or where truth is stored. Instead, people change tools. Institutions shift budgets. New habits creep into daily life. And over decades, the entire structure of memory tilts. You could call that a reset, but not the dramatic kind where everything is wiped and replaced. It is slower, stranger. The underlying systems of truth and recall are rewired while everyone is busy doing something else. We have been through this before. When writing appeared, it did not arrive with a banner announcing, "The oral age is over." Scribes started keeping tallies on clay. Priests started recording rituals. Kings began to fix laws in text. Storytellers still told stories, elders still held genealogies in their heads, but slowly authority slid toward the tablet. If a dispute arose, the crucial question became less, who remembers correctly, and more, what does the record say? That was a regime change in memory. The same thing happened with print. At first, printed books imitated manuscripts. They used similar fonts, similar layouts, even fake handwritten flourishes. But underneath, something enormous had shifted. Copies could be made in the hundreds, then thousands. Errors could be standardized. Doctrines could be frozen into text and mailed across continents. Truth began to wear the uniform of the printed page. In the broadcast era, Memory reorganized again. Radio and television could show millions of people the same event, the same night, framed by the same commentators. Shared experience became synchronized. What happened was, for many, whatever appeared on the evening news. If you were not on the air, you were barely in the story. Each time the reset worked not by erasing the past at once, but by changing which institutions people trusted and which media they treated as decisive when memories conflicted. The AI era is another such shift, but it has some new properties that make it feel less like a gentle tilt and more like living on a slowly rotating platform. First, speed. Writing moved slowly. Printing accelerated things but still operated on the pace of weeks and months. Broadcast could respond in hours. Networked AI systems can revise the apparent past in minutes. A policy change, a training update, a newly ingested dataset, and the answers you receive about an event, a concept or a person can subtly change everywhere at once. The second difference is personalization. A clay tablet did not adjust its inscription based on who was reading it. A printed book did not shuffle paragraphs depending on your mood. Even television, with its demographic targeting, still sent the same signal through the air. AI-mediated memory does not have to work that way. Two people can ask the same question of a model and receive answers tuned to their language, their prior behavior, their likely preferences. Over time, this can create gently diverging worlds of recall. Not outright propaganda for one side and another, but different emphases, different omissions, different defaults about what is important. Third, and perhaps most unsettling, is synthetic generation. For most of history, memory media mainly stored. They captured something that already existed. Spoken words, handwritten texts, painted scenes, photographs of real moments. There were always forgeries and illusions, but the link between record and prior event was, at least in principle, traceable. Now we are filling our archives with things that never happened but look like they did. Text that reads like an eyewitness, generated from patterns in previous witnesses. Images that resemble photographs, built out of pixels and probabilities. Videos of people saying words they never spoke. Over time, as these synthetic artifacts circulate, they join the training data for future systems. The line between record of an event and record of a model's imagination about an event becomes harder to draw, especially for anyone who does not have specialized tools or training. Put these three together, speed, personalization, and generation, and you get the conditions for something new, parallel histories. Not just different interpretations of the same record which humans have always had, but different records from the start. Different sets of documents, clips, and AI summaries that feel complete within themselves, each supported by its own web of citations and search results. One community's memory of a protest might center on police violence, eyewitness clips, long threads of testimony, and investigative reports. Another community's memory of the same day might center on property damage, official statements, and expert commentary that rarely mentions the rest. Both sides will be able to ask their AI tools what really happened and receive answers that harmonize with their local archive. Across borders, language groups, and platforms, these divergences can grow, not with a single dramatic break, but like tectonic plates drifting apart, a centimetre a year, invisible until the fault line cracks. This is what a slow civilization reset looks like from inside. The basic questions. What is evidence? Whose record counts? How do we resolve conflicting memories? Are being answered in new ways, often by systems that are treated as neutral tools rather than as participants in the argument. Yet resets do not run on technology alone. They stabilize or spiral depending on what societies build around them. In the writing era, scribes developed conventions, dates, signatures, seals, witnessed copies. In the print era, we invented footnotes, bibliographies, and scholarly peer review. In the broadcast era, we argued about journalistic standards, codes of ethics and public regulators. These were all attempts to say, here is how you can tell a more reliable record from a less reliable one, even if the line was never perfect. The AI era will likely grow its own stabilizers. Some will be technical, cryptographic signatures on original recordings, open logs of model training data, public registries of major content edits. Some will be institutional, independent audit bodies that evaluate platforms' memory practices, archives that keep frozen snapshots of events before algorithms reshape their visibility. And some will be personal, a kind of literacy, learning to ask, where did this answer come from? What sources is this system leaning on? How would someone else's interface show this differently? Will matter as much as knowing how to read did in the age of print. None of these responses will be perfect. Bias will remain. Power will flow towards some archives and away from others. There will be places where histories clash and never fully reconcile. But over time, the combination of norms, tools, and literacies can turn a chaotic reset into a new, if uneasy, equilibrium. A world where people understand that the past they see through their screens is not the past itself, but one possible arrangement of it. A world where choosing your memory tools becomes as consequential as choosing your leaders. And in that world, the next question quietly appears. If our shared past is starting to fracture into parallel versions, how will we make decisions together when the next crisis comes, and whose memories will guide us when everything is on fire? One answer now being proposed is simple in theory and brutal in practice: tag everything. In this vision, every photo, every video, every document that begins its life in a camera, a microphone, or a word processor would carry a sort of birth certificate. A cryptographic stamp saying, this device captured this data at this time in this place. The moment it is edited, that change would be logged. Crop a frame, adjust the contrast, cut out a sentence, run an AI enhancement filter. Each step would append another line to the record. Technologists call this content provenance or content credentials. Instead of judging a clip by how convincing it looks, you inspect its chain of custody. Where did it come from? Who touched it? What was changed? And when? In the best-case version, this creates something like a meta-population for truth. Individual files can be copied, reposted, remixed, or faked. But the underlying network of signatures still exists, scattered across devices and servers. A forged video can spread and go extinct when debunked, but the original, with its intact provenance, survives elsewhere and can be used to repopulate the narrative. There is real strength here. Unlike a watermark you can paint over, a well-designed provenance system does not live in the pixels or the text alone. It lives in cryptography, in signatures that cannot easily be forged without access to private keys. It creates an external reference point, a way to say, this is not just plausible. It is provably connected to a specific origin. But like all tools in previous resets, it comes with limitations. First, it helps most when everyone plays along. If only major newsrooms and a few governments sign their media, then unsigned content is not automatically false. It is simply from somewhere else. Bad actors can flood the zone with untagged fakes, or worse, with forged tags that look official to anyone who does not check carefully. Second, provenance can tell you what happened to a file, not whether the original moment was staged, biased, or selectively framed. A propaganda photo can have a perfect, unbroken credential chain. A misleading statistic can be signed by the world's most advanced math engine. Cryptography does not grant moral honesty. It just proves that the liar is really the one who published it. And third, provenance can quietly create new gatekeepers. If the default assumption becomes trust only what carries an approved credential, then whoever controls the approval list controls the boundary of legitimacy. Alongside provenance, you will hear about watermarks and signatures on AI-generated content, invisible patterns in the pixels, statistical fingerprints in the text, hidden markers in the audio waveform that say, "This was made by Model X on Platform Y." These are often described as a silver bullet, a way for platforms and regulators to tell authentic from synthetic at scale. But watermarks live in a harsher world than their designers. Any detectable pattern can, in principle, be detected by an adversary, and if it can be detected, it can usually be removed or imitated. You can crop the frame, re-encode the file, add noise, or run the image through another model that deliberately scrambles known signatures. On the other side, you can take a genuine photograph and inject a fake watermark to make it look artificial. This turns watermarking into a cat and mouse game, an evolutionary arms race. One generation of models learns to embed more robust signatures. Another generation of laundering tools learns to strip or mimic them. Platforms deploy detectors, adversaries test against those detectors and adapt. Over time, you do not get a clean separation between marked AI and unmarked reality. You get a blurred middle, a gradient of probability. So the role of these techniques may not be to perfectly label every piece of media. It may be more modest, provide enough friction, enough signal that institutions and investigators have something to work with. A place to start a deeper check, rather than a final verdict. This, in turn, changes what we ask of journalism and archives. For most of the print and broadcast era, their primary function was to publish, to collect information, select what mattered, and push it outward in newspapers, books, bulletins, and nightly news segments. Verification was part of the process, but it was mostly invisible, folded into the reporting and editing. In an AI-saturated memory ecosystem, verification itself may become a service. Newsrooms could maintain public registries of original footage, with cryptographic hashes and provenance trails available for anyone to inspect. Archives might store not just copies of content, but snapshots of information environments at specific moments, what headlines looked like before an algorithm change, what search results looked like before a government request, what an AI model answered before its training data shifted. When a deepfake circulates, the question would not only be, did you report on this, but also, can you attest that this is not in your archive of originals? Can you show your own evidence for what happened instead? The value of an institution would rest less on its voice, more on its ability to anchor a drifting environment with documented, time-stamped, auditable records. Of course, no institution is universally trusted. That is where communities come in. We already see early forms of community fact-checking, collaborative documents, open-source intelligence investigations, online volunteers geolocating videos, identifying weapon types, comparing shadows to satellite paths. These networks can be astonishingly fast and precise. They can also be fragmented, ideological, or targeted by disinformation campaigns. The trade-off is stark. Institutional authority can provide consistency, legal accountability, and resources for long-term archiving. But it can also be captured by states, corporations, or factions. Community-driven verification can be more transparent and participatory, but also more chaotic, more vulnerable to social pressure, harassment, and echo chambers. Societies may end up with layered systems where institutions publish their methods and data, and communities audit them in public. Disputes over memory would move out of closed editorial meetings and into open, sometimes messy scrutiny. The line between expert and amateur would blur, not because expertise disappears, but because its claims have to survive a swarm of networked eyes. Underneath all of this will be a quieter shift in where trust actually lives. In earlier eras, trust pooled around shared symbols, the seal on a scroll, the imprint of a press, the logo of a broadcaster. In the AI era, it might move in two directions at once. One path is toward the local. People may lean more on sources they know directly, a friend who was there, a neighborhood group with a track record, a historian whose work they have followed for years, a small outlet that specializes in one region or topic. Reality becomes something you triangulate through overlapping circles of partial trust, not something delivered from a single towering institution. The other path is toward the cryptographic. When human institutions are destructed, algorithms can step in as referees, blockchains recording when a file first appeared, distributed ledgers of model updates, zero-knowledge proofs that a photo has not been altered since capture without revealing everything about the device that took it. In this world, you do not trust a person exactly. You trust that a mathematical protocol would be very hard, though not impossible, to fake. Neither path is comfortable. Local trust can harden into closed communities with their own sealed histories. Cryptographic trust can obscure human responsibility behind phrases like "the system says" and "the hash matches." But together, they sketch the outlines of how societies might try to hold on to a shared reality, while the tools of memory keep changing underneath them. Not by restoring the illusion that every record is pure, every archive neutral, every screen a faithful window onto the past. Instead, by building enough scaffolding, technical, institutional, communal, that when the next wave of synthetic memories arrives, it has to pass through layers of questions, signatures and skeptical eyes before it can reshape what we believe. And that leaves one more layer, the one no system can provide for you: how each person, sitting with their own life story, chooses to remember in an age when forgetting, editing and rewriting have never been easier. So what does that actually look like? Not for civilizations, but for you. If the large-scale memory systems of the 21st century are unstable, then each person becomes a kind of micro-archive, a tiny metapopulation of recollection trying not to go extinct. One way to think about it is simple. You are not just living your life, you are curating evidence for your future self. That starts with habits that feel almost boring compared to AI headlines. When you read something that matters, don't just trust that the tab will be open tomorrow or that the algorithm will show it to you again someday. Save it. Not just the link, which can rot or be edited, but enough of the content that future you can reconstruct what you actually saw. Copy out a key paragraph with the date. Jot down, in your own words, why it caught your attention. Add the source, the author, the outlet, the book, the speech. If it's a video, note the title, channel, timestamp, and what claim was made. You're building context, not just a scrapbook. Context is what lets you look back in 10 years and say, this is what I believed then, and this is what I was shown, instead of staring at a stripped, delinked screenshot and wondering if it was real. Some people create simple systems for this: a notes file per month, a running sources document, a folder of PDFs and copied articles with a short summary at the top of each. The tools do not matter as much as the pattern: capture, label, and explain why it mattered at the time. Alongside this, there is the question of inputs. If your sense of the world flows from a single feed, a social platform, a recommended YouTube page, a personalized news app, you're living inside one channel of the post-bottleneck river. It may feel vast, but it is narrow, tuned quietly to engagement and prediction. You can widen that channel on purpose. Pick at least 2 or 3 very different streams of information about the same topics: a long-form newsletter, a print magazine, a local paper, a public broadcaster, a niche blog, a historian you trust. Let them collide. When something important happens, an election, a protest, a scientific breakthrough, watch how different outlets frame it. Which details appear everywhere? Which show up only once? Which questions remain unanswered in every version? Over time, that practice builds an internal sense of this is how single-feed histories sound. You start to notice what is missing, not just what is present. This is also where basic verification comes in, not as a professional investigator, but as someone who does not want their memory colonized by the first plausible story. The simplest rule is triangulation. If a surprising claim matters to your understanding of the world, do not stop at one source. Look for at least 2 or 3 independent confirmations, ideally with different incentives. A government report and a critical NGO, a mainstream outlet and a specialist blog, a local reporter and a global wire service. When possible, trace things back to primary materials. The actual study instead of just the headline about it, the transcript instead of the pull quote, the original speech rather than the commentary. You will not always have the time or energy to do this. That is fine, but noticing when you do not check is part of the habit. You mentally tag the belief as provisional, something held lightly rather than carved into the stone of your personal story. The challenge is to cultivate skepticism without sliding into reflexive cynicism. Skepticism says, what is the evidence, and who is making this claim? Cynicism says, everyone is lying, so nothing matters. The first builds a more resilient memory. The second erodes it, because if nothing is trustworthy, there is no point in remembering anything carefully. AI sits awkwardly inside this picture. It can either be a fog machine or it can be a tool for sharpening the edges of what you know. One way to keep it in the second category is to demand an audit trail from your AI tools. Instead of asking, what happened in event X? Ask, what are the main interpretations of event X? And can you cite specific sources for each? When you get an answer, follow the links. Check whether the sources actually say what the model claims they say. Save the ones that matter into your own system. You can also ask AI to show its uncertainty. List what is well established about this topic, what is contested, and what is speculative. Mark them clearly. This does not guarantee honesty, but it forces the model to expose some of its internal gradations instead of giving you a single flattened narrative. Treat AI summaries as maps, not territories. They are starting points for your own verification, not replacements for it. If you use AI to draft notes, ask it to append a short source list at the end, and to distinguish between direct citations, general knowledge, and model-generated inference. Then, over time, you will be able to look back not just at what you learned, but at where that learning came from in the AI era. All of that is the rational scaffolding. Underneath it sits something softer, rituals of remembrance. For most of human history, memory was not just lodged in tools and institutions. It was carried by stories told and retold, family sagas, local legends, lists of who was born, who married, who died. The form changes, but the function remains the same. It keeps a thread running between generations. Journaling is one of the simplest modern versions of this. Not a perfect daily record, but a periodic attempt to fix in words what your life feels like from the inside. What you believed this month, what frightened you, what you were wrong about, what surprised you. These entries are not only for nostalgia. They are anchor points. When your memory shifts, as it always does, you will have an external trace of your earlier self to compare against. Family stories are another layer. Make time, occasionally, to ask older relatives about their own versions of history. How did they hear about major events? What do they remember differently from the official story? What did their parents tell them? Record these conversations if they are comfortable with it. Date them. Write a short note about the circumstances. You are not just preserving facts, you are preserving perspectives, the texture of how reality felt to different people at different times. Local archives, too, are a kind of antidote to algorithmic memory. Visit a town museum, a city archive, a community centre that keeps old newsletters, photographs, meeting minutes. Notice what they record that never makes it into national narratives: minor floods, school openings, lost industries, vanished neighbourhoods. If you can contribute, donate labelled photographs. Write down your recollection of a local event and offer it to the archive. Help index or transcribe old records. These are small acts, but they thicken the fabric of collective memory in the places you actually inhabit. And somewhere in the midst of these habits, there is room for curiosity beyond the present crisis. If you're the kind of person who likes to fall asleep thinking about the deep past and its unresolved puzzles, you might enjoy exploring our book about 12 Unexplained Mysteries of Human History. You can find it on our website. There is a link in the description, another little archive of questions we still do not know how to answer. In the end, building a durable memory in the age of AI is not about resisting technology or trusting it completely. It is about recognizing that your own mind is now one node in a vast, unstable network, and choosing to become an active custodian of what passes through it. To save what matters, to question what arrives too smoothly, to weave your experiences into stories that will still make sense when today's feeds have vanished into broken links and outdated formats. You will not preserve everything. No one ever has. But with a few deliberate strategies, you can give future, you and the people who come after you, something our ancestors fought desperately to maintain through bottlenecks and disasters, a path back through the noise, to a remembered world that is not entirely at the mercy of whatever the machines decide to show next. Across this whole story, from the first storytellers around a fire to servers humming in anonymous data centers, the pattern has been the same. We build tools to help us remember, and those tools quietly change what remembering means. Clay tablets made debts and laws harder to forget, but they also shifted power towards scribes and palaces. Printing presses multiplied ideas, but they also froze certain versions of the Bible, of law, of science, into standard truth. Photographs felt like memory made solid, even as they cropped reality into frames and angles someone chose. Broadcast media synchronized emotions across millions of people at once, but left almost no room for individual stories that did not fit the schedule. The internet promised endless archives and delivered them along with new ways for things to vanish, be edited, or be buried under noise. AI is just the newest turn of this screw, an archive that not only holds what we have said, but can remix it, extend it, and sometimes invent it. It can help surface forgotten voices, summarize long histories, translate old documents, and offer maps through unimaginable amounts of information. It can also flood the zone with synthetic events, plausible fictions, comforting lies, and personalized histories that never quite existed. No one knows exactly how far this will go. There may be future safeguards we cannot yet see, or future failures we have not imagined. Memory regimes have shifted before without anyone voting on them. They may shift again, faster this time. But even inside that uncertainty, a few things remain remarkably stable. Meaning still emerges in conversation, not just in data. A story only becomes history when it is shared, questioned, argued over, retold. Community still shapes what endures. Families, neighborhoods, schools, online groups, all of them decide day by day which stories get repeated and which are allowed to fade. And intentional memory is still different from passive exposure. Taking notes, keeping journals, saving sources, recording elders, participating in local archives. These are not just hobbies. They are ways of saying this mattered and I'm willing to carry some of the weight of remembering it. AI can assist with that work, or it can replace it with something thinner. The hinge is your attention, and the choices you make about what to trust, what to save, and what to pass on. If you have listened this far, you are already participating in that choice. As we drift towards sleep, you might notice which parts of this story you want to keep. The ancient bottlenecks, the first libraries. The idea that your notes today might be someone's archive tomorrow. If you would like more slow histories like this, you can support the channel by gently tapping like, leaving a comment, and subscribing so you do not miss future episodes. Tell us if you feel like sharing where you are listening from tonight, the city, the country, or just on a late train, in a quiet room, somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow. And if you want to help this project in the best way, you can also listen on Spotify. There is a link in the description. That helps keep these long, careful stories sustainable, so that together we can continue to remember, imperfectly, humanly, but on purpose.